The Hidden World by Paul Park. DB 66878. Copyright 2008 by Paul Park. Read by Jill Fox. This book contains 317 pages. Approximate reading time 12 hours 25 minutes. This book contains markers allowing direct access to the parts and acknowledgments at Level 1 and to the chapters at Level 2. Library of Congress annotation. Miranda, a Roumanian princess who can shapeshift into the White Tyger, faces the spirit world enemy's evil baroness, Nicola Ceausescu, unlocked before her death. Meanwhile, Miranda's love, Army Captain Peter, struggles to survive as he battles a Turkish offensive. Sequel to The White Tyger, RC 64407. For senior high readers, 2008. From the book jacket. The Hidden World is the concluding volume in Paul Park's remarkable tale of Romania, a world that is both more real and yet also more mysterious and magical than our own. After discovering that she is the lost princess of Romania and the mythical White Tyger, Miranda finds that her fate is still uncertain. The ghosts of her enemies still cluster about her. The insane spirit of the baroness takes possession of her body for a time, and demons released by her mother are abroad in Romania. And through it all, her heart calls out to Peter, away with the army, whom she has come to love, and her best friend Andromeda, sworn to help her and protect her. There are no easy answers. It all looks impossible. Any answers may lie only in the hidden world of spirits, where death is but an inconvenience, and she is the most powerful creature of all, the White Tyger. About the author. Paul Park is the author of A Princess of Romania, The Tourmaline, The White Tyger, Sugar Rain, and Celestis. He lives in North Adams, Massachusetts. Other books by Paul Park: Soldiers of Paradise, The Cult of Loving Kindness, The Gospel of Corax, Three Marys, If Lions Could Speak and Other Stories, No Traveler Returns. This book is for Deborah, with love. 1. Rest and Recompense. 1. Miranda Popescu dreams of home. 200 kilometers to the north and east of Bucharest, in a farmhouse in the village of Stănești, Miranda lay asleep. After dinner, she had retired to her bedroom with a head cold. Now, past midnight, propped up on the pillows, she lay with her mouth open. Then she turned onto her side, and her dream changed. It wasn't entirely a dream. That winter in her room she had become accustomed to the many intermediate states between sleeping and waking. She had been sick for much of the season, a lung infection that, without antibiotics, had lingered until the weather turned. Her hostess, the Comtesse de Rougemont, and then later her mother, had dosed her with medicinals. She'd scarcely left her room. Of course, she had undertaken several small journeys to the secret world, with the help of her secret tourmaline, Johannes Kepler's eye. Now it was almost springtime, and she was feeling better. This particular journey had started with a daydream. She had sat with a French novel, her mind wandering, and, as often happened, it had wandered back to the invented refuge that her Aunt Egypta Schenk von Schenk had made for her in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, where she had gone to high school. She had lived with Stanley and Rachel, her adoptive parents, in the house on the college green in the middle of town. Her best friend had been Andromeda Bailey, boyish and beautiful, her gray eyes spotted with blue and black and silver. Peter Gross had been in her class at school, and she had gotten to know him too. They had spent some time together in the woods the summer Andromeda had gone to Europe. Often, as he sat cross-legged in the dirt or on a rock, he'd have a piece of a leaf or a twig in his brown hair. Often he'd have a blade of grass between his teeth. Sometimes he'd be playing his harmonica, a poor, private kind of music that she indulged. He only had the one hand. His right hand was missing because of a birth defect. In those days, all her knowledge of Romania had come from dreams, fantasies, and a few stray memories. The facts she'd learned in school or on her own had been all lies or else distortions. The communist dictator, Nicola Ceausescu, the history of Eastern Europe. No, it had been the Baroness Nicola Ceausescu who had sent an emissary to bring her home to Bucharest. His name was Kevin Markasev, and he was famous here. He'd gone all that way to find her, and he had burned the book of her invented childhood in a fire on Christmas Hill above the Art Museum. Then morning came, and the world was different. Peter and Andromeda were different too. Daydreaming in Staro Selo, Miranda had found her way to Christmas Hill again, and she had climbed it in the dark. She had climbed back to the start of the story. The French novel lay in her lap, spine up, inverted. 3/4 of the way through, already she could see the end, the denouement. It was reassuring and annoying to perceive it in the distance, the place where everything was sealed up in a circle, and some kind of homecoming was possible, some journey, or at least some reference to the beginning once again. You'd go back, and you'd know something new, and you would take consolation from that new thing, a consolation that was phony and real at the same time. So she indulged herself. She closed her eyes and imagined the dark night, the bonfire and the hummocks of grass on the hillside. The place was still there for her, and in a moment she could see it clearly, and Kevin Markasev above her with the little book, her essential history, the entire story of her childhood balanced in his hands. Only this time, as he dropped it, she thought she might reach up to catch it, bat it away from the consuming fire. Andromeda was there, and Peter might come running down to help her, tripping and sliding down the slope. As she struggled with Kevin Markasev, he might pull him off her, chase him away, and she'd lie on her back. Maybe she'd have knocked her head against a stone, and Peter would be on his knees above her. "Are you all right?" he'd say, reaching to touch her face. "Are you all right?" he'd repeat, and she'd be happy to hear his voice, even though he might be implying some kind of weakness. "Of course I'm all right," she'd think, and then she'd say aloud, "I'm fine," which maybe she could make into the truth. But the question was, if she had known then what she knew now, would she have wanted to preserve the book or to destroy it? Would she have been strong enough to hold out her bruised hands, accept the changing world and everything that was to come? In the dream she was not strong enough. Propped on pillows in her bed in Madame de Rougemont's farmhouse, she found herself muttering these words again. "I'm fine." Her French novel dropped to the floor. She turned onto her side. Her daydream was no longer in her strict control. It had turned into an actual dream, a provisional dream only one step below consciousness. The three friends left Kevin Markasev where he lay stunned beside the burning fire. They left him and continued down the cow field, through the fences and the trees, until they reached the Art Museum parking lot at the bottom of the hill. There was some tension between them as they split up, each to walk home through the deserted pre-dawn streets. And when she reached her parents' house, the door was unlocked. She slipped inside as silently as she knew how. She could see from the front hall where Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch. She had waited up, which was comforting and irritating. She lay under the tartan blanket, curled up, mouth out of shape on the pillow. Sleep had cleaned her face. Miranda wouldn't wake her. Silent as a ghost, she climbed the stairs to her own room on the 3rd floor, feeling wired and exhausted from the eventful night. In the bathroom on the landing, she undressed, put on her PJs, flossed and brushed her teeth. Then she slipped into her cozy bed, cozy and private as this one in the farmhouse, on the slope of the mountain outside of town. She fell asleep, and in her dream her Aunt Egypta came to her. This was a different kind of dreaming, deeper and more powerful. It felt like being awake. Egypta Shank was dressed in a long coat trimmed with fox fur, and the little wicked heads hung down. She was wearing gloves, and a small pillbox hat was pinned to her gray face. Her face was partly covered in a veil, Ma petite chère, she said. Miranda wouldn't let her start with that. She sat up in her bed, which, in her dream, was the one she actually occupied in Staro Selo. "Tell me," she said in English. "I was thinking about Peter Gross. Peter and Andromeda, my friends. Tell me, where are they?" There was a pause. Miranda could see part of her aunt's face under the veil. Her lips were thin. "Peter de Graz is in Staro Selo with the 11th Mountaineers. There is a Turkish offensive in that area." Miranda knew that much herself. She could see her aunt's lips, part of her nose. Her smile had no joy in it. "My dear girl, you will not fail to surprise me, the loyalty you give to these two men, your father's aides-de-camp. They were junior officers, and the ones closest to hand in a time of crisis. That is all. They were meant to protect you, at which task they have not distinguished themselves. Instead, you have saved de Graz's life more than once." As sometimes happens in dreams, Miranda tried to speak but couldn't. "I am punished for my cowardice and my mistakes," continued her aunt. "I have been dead 6 years, and I am punished every day. In the book I gave you to take to Massachusetts, I described a war in Europe. A terrible war. Do you remember? You asked me about it once." Now she pulled her veil back, and Miranda could see her eyes. They had a yellow tinge. She went on. "It was my plan to give you a book in a language you didn't know, and as a grown woman you would learn to read it. Later you would follow the directives I had printed out, and with the coins I left in your possession, you would find your way to Great Romania. By yourself, you would find your way. I thought perhaps I would not live to see it, not that it mattered. But you would be wise with the wisdom from the book and your own life." Fat chance, Miranda thought, and tried to speak, but she could not speak aloud. "Then my enemies were planning my destruction," her aunt said, "and I didn't want to die. I thought of a new plan, and I goaded Nicola Ceausescu to send that boy to bring you home. Prematurely, as it turned out. And now the coins were for me, so you could free me from Tara Mortilor. Blind Rodica and Gregor Spla, who were my contingency, now supported the entire scheme, and they were too weak for that. And you were too young to be sensible when I met you in the land of the dead. There also you worried about the Graz and Prochenko, because of the damage they had suffered. It was not meant to be like this. Mixtures of people and animals from 2 worlds. What good are they now? As for me, I gambled my life and could not win it back. And I think this is the reason. I could not bear the thought of never seeing you again." Because this was a dream, it could not capture the emotions of the real world. Her Aunt Egypta's voice was calm, her face almost expressionless. "Oh, my dear, you were too young. And you are still too young. Too young for these tools I have put into your hands. Too young to leave your friends behind and accept your fortune. Too young to listen to my guidance." These words filled Miranda with an old frustration. How could I be too young, she thought. Her aunt had stolen away whole years, whole blocks of time, and yet still blamed her. And she was wrong. Miranda had done everything she wanted. How could she have done better after all? Now Miranda could speak again, and so she totted up a list of her achievements. "The Germans have left Bucharest," she said. "The Empress is dead. The Elector of Ratisbon is dead. His prisoners are free. Nicola Ceausescu is dead." Silence. Then her aunt spoke again. "That is true. That is all true, though you are not responsible for all of it. But even if you were, you have not accomplished everything. And there is still much more. We have new enemies. Enemies without end. Bocu, Antonescu. And now these demons, Nicola Ceausescu managed to unlock before she died. I meant them to serve you. I meant you to use them wisely, with my guidance. Instead, they are infected with Nicola Ceausescu's hate, and they have brought the world into this war. So there are new tasks for us. It is an illusion if we reach a place of safety among the waves. Miranda listened to the coarse, grainy whisper, which continued, But you still have weapons, even though you might not understand how to use them. You have the power I have given you, your father's revolver, and the black book, and the tourmaline, though you have managed to do something unexpected once again, because of your stubbornness. But even so, I think you must be able to learn. I have hope, and I have faith in you. Miranda felt a surge of despondency. Because of my stubbornness, she thought. Then why was she so desperate to please? What should I do now? She almost asked. Tell me what to do, she almost asked. Tell me, she asked instead. Is anything left of what I left behind? You know, where I grew up in Massachusetts. That was a calm place in the waves. And the smile on the ghost's face was softer now, touched with love, or else a kind of condescension. Child, she said, every object has a symbol in the hidden world. Its counterpart. A moment, and then she started again. That town, those streets, those people. You might make a version for yourself in the land of the dead. A little corner for yourself in Tara Mortilor. Or you might search for it and find it in the hidden world. Scientists have quarreled on this subject. You might find it with the tools I've given you. Would you abandon everything for that? Everything that's yet to come? And if you did, it wouldn't be the same, of course. That place, it was your childhood. Who can say she has not done what you have done? There was some more of that kind of talk before Miranda woke in the same dark bedroom, the same bed where she had spent the last part of the dream. But in the dream she hadn't had this cold in her head, which filled up her sinuses as if with wadded cotton. Now awake, she found it hard to breathe until she sat up. A lamp burned on the bedside table near her hand. There was a handkerchief beside the lamp, whose wick was turned down low. She blew her nose. She did not disturb the woman curled on the settee under a plaid blanket. Rachel, her adoptive mother in the dream, also did not budge when Miranda had come in the door, climbed the creaking stairs. The settee was in a bay of dark windows overlooking the vegetable garden. Miranda got out of bed, then crossed the bare floorboards. She stopped before an artist's easel. Clara Brankovanu was skilled at drawing in charcoal and red pencil. During Miranda's illness, she had occupied her time with a sketching pad. Most recently, she had made a series of landscapes from the window, the back garden and the fields beyond, rising toward the forest and the mountainside. Outside the glass, it was gray night. Miranda turned her face toward the ticking clock. The hour before dawn. She looked down at the woman's hair, carefully pinned into little wheels. She felt a mix of comfort and annoyance that was familiar. Ever since she had caught this cold, her mother had insisted on sleeping in her room, afraid of a recurrence of the pneumonia. Though what she could have done if it came back, Miranda wasn't sure. Hold her hand, she supposed, bring her hot things to drink as she had done before. Hold the bowl for her to spit. Even so, after these months of loving care, it was still hard for Miranda to think this woman was her mother, her actual birth mother. Growing up in Massachusetts, she had resented Rachel the most when she was being too maternal. Sometimes, though, Rachel and Clara seemed to combine, unified by how she'd treated them. unified also at moments like this, when they performed the same activity, occupied the same space. Clara Brankovinu was propped on a little bolster in the arm of the settee. Her mouth was open, and her breath came soft. A woman in her 50s, but prematurely old, with weak, sallow skin in the lamplight. Half her life a prisoner, she had been a beauty at one time. Miranda had seen a portrait in the People's Palace. And, of course, there was the sepia photograph in her locket. She found she could still remember every word Egyptoshank had said, standing in this corner of the room in her dream. Now Miranda tiptoed out the door and down the hall, hoping everyone would stay asleep. She was still in her clothes, and in the cabinet at the bottom of the stairs she groped in the darkness for a coat. The two big mutts were there on the round rug. They stirred to greet her, pressing their faces into her hand. They were named Lucius and Lionel. When she opened the bolt, they scratched against the door jamb, eager to get out. First light was coming. There was fog in the fields behind the house, and in the paddock on the other side of the stone wall. She followed the path to the edge of the evergreens, and then climbed up through the meadow. From time to time she would stop to clear her nose, using a technique Stanley had shown her on camping trips in Maine. You would put your thumb over each nostril in turn, then bend down into the bushes and exhale with your mouth closed. If you were dainty and careful, the spray wouldn't get on your clothes. When she straightened up again, her head was ringing. The air was cold and sharp as she sucked it in. She hadn't had much to eat the night before, and she still felt sort of terrible, her lungs delicate and easily exhausted. The dogs roamed away from her, appearing and disappearing in the mist. She was working on the things Egyptoshank had said, and whether they were true. Often, when she walked by herself or sat up in her room, she would think about Peter and Andromeda, and then stop thinking about them. At such moments her thoughts were like these two black dogs, superficially free. Yet always the dogs returned to her, reappeared to check on her, and they were never more than 50 yards away. She had not seen either of her friends for months. Without a doubt, as her aunt had suggested, she had more pressing concerns. She was the White Tyger of Roumania, and what she did or failed to do was important, even here, in this little village in the mountains. The country was at war, the Turks on one side and the Germans on the other. Colonel Victor Bocu had consolidated power in Bucharest after the death of Nicola Ceausescu, with the help of a fraudulent National Assembly. His Rezistenta party had taken 54% of the first vote. When the Turks began to mobilize, Bocu had refused to listen to any of their demands, some of which were not unreasonable. The return of territories ceded under the Peace of Havza in Prince Frederick's time. Bocu had used the threat of war, and then the war itself to justify his political position, which was unforgivable. Doubtless he was an evil man, and doubtless the White Tyger could find a way to destroy him, which was what Egyptoshank would have wanted or advised. Doubtless, except Miranda was full of doubts. Destroying the wicked never seemed to change the world. In the misty pasture, Miranda paused and let the dogs come to her. It was easy for these subjects, important as they were, to disappear into abstraction. She scanned the treetops, moisture on her face, worrying instead about Peter in the trenches, and Andromeda, wherever she was. These political issues were too hard to make real, except through the experience of people you cared about. They were her friends from Massachusetts, however much they had been battered and transformed. Without them she was abandoned, lost. But everybody had to break free finally. Wasn't that what her aunt had said? Egyptoshank had made no provision for Peter de Gratz and Sasha Prochenko, wasted no thought on what might happen to them once their purpose was accomplished. Now they had limped home. Peter Gross, Peter de Gratz, the ape and the scarlet bug. Prochenko, Andromeda, and the yellow dog. They had suffered for Miranda's sake. So maybe it was her duty to worry about them, and maybe that duty was as strong as what she owed to great Roumania. The mist hung round her at the top of the meadow. The dogs barged out of it and into it again. The house was out of sight. Miranda touched the golden bracelet at her wrist, and then she closed her eyes. In her mind, she reached down and searched among the stones for the jewel, the tourmaline, her entry to the hidden world. The last time she had come this way, she had wrapped it in a sock and left it in a secure place marked by a rock cairn. Now she found it and unwrapped it and held it in her hand. What had her aunt said about Berkshire County, Massachusetts, America? You might search for it and find it in the hidden world. You might find it with the tools I've given you. The bright sun broke over her and drove the mist away. Miranda was in a high meadow on a high mountain slope. She stood in the grass around her knees. It was springtime and morning time, and the birds were singing. A brandywine bird was hidden in the grass. She knew its song. And above her she saw a big butterfly that was floating down, flapping wearily as if it had traveled a long way. What a lovely spot! The sun was shining over the rock peaks. She had no doubt that in the grass with her, hidden there or maybe in that stand of birches, she would find the dog, the ape, the bug. They would share all this together, and all danger, too. As if conjured by the word, as she pushed through the grass, she saw where it came to an end at a sort of a cliff. Below her the ground had been scooped out, a wound in the red and black earth. Smells came from it. A garbage dump here in this beautiful place, an uncovered pit that was so big she couldn't see the end of it. And there was movement down there in the garbage, a multitude of animals and creatures in a dump that receded into darkness as she looked. Peter Gross was in the trenches in Staro Selo. God, she couldn't stand it. She laid down the jewel, and the world shuddered to life again, the real world, where she stood above Staro Selo. But there, too, the sun had broken through a cleft in the high peaks. There, too, the mist had cleared, and she could see the town with its little railway station and the temple of Demeter with its turnip dome. She could see the farmhouse down below. The dogs came to her and licked her hands, then ran off again. For several minutes, she stood immobile on the slope. She remembered climbing up here with Andromeda the year before, after she'd escaped from Nicola Ceausescu and the People's Palace. It was one of the first mornings, and they had walked through the barley fields behind the house, then up the slope. In this same meadow they had looked down at the black and green farmhouse and the slate-roofed village around the temple, the railway and the road. Sort of takes you back, Andromeda had said in English. At moments, as they climbed, Miranda had been struck by how easy this felt, just like walking to school over Christmas Hill. At other times, Andromeda seemed a stranger to her, untiring, unsweating, though she always kept her mouth open and spat from time to time into the grass. They scarcely spoke. Moment by moment, it was as if they passed through alternating currents of familiarity and strangeness. Dressed in the same black suit and creamy linen for 2 days, Andromeda still looked stylish and well-groomed. How beautiful she was, Miranda thought, not for the first time. Her skin seemed to glow, an effect of the morning sunlight and the fine golden hair that seemed to cover her. Her teeth were white and shiny, disconcertingly large. She let her tongue loll out, then touched her lips. Nor did it matter if she was really someone else, some cavalry lieutenant or whatever. People were what they were. Everyone was a zoo inside if you could just scrape off the skin. She'd left that evening or the next evening to take the night train back to Bucharest. "A bientôt," she'd said when the carriage came to the door. One thing Miranda had not discussed with her was Peter Gross, or Peter de Gratz, and her feelings for one or both of them. Now, alone with the dogs running back and forth, She remembered what he had looked like in the gazebo by the lake in the park, under the plum-colored sky, the last time she had seen him. Nor did she understand, still, why they had had to separate, except because he'd wanted to. It was his choice, his decision. She had assumed he'd stay with her, and something would change and they would touch each other as they'd touched each other in the palace cell where they were prisoners. And that would be all right, and even normal in some way, like something that was supposed to happen all along. And she would feel what? All she could see now was his dirty, brooding face, marked along his cheek with scabs or abrasions, and made unfamiliar by the lantern's oblique glare in the little brick gazebo in the park. Certainly, in her mind's eye, he looked threatening and unappealing. But maybe that was normal too under the circumstances. Who knew what normal was? This landscape of feelings, this really was the hidden world, stranger than a mountain top or garbage pit. And she was no white tiger in that landscape, that was sure. This stuff had always made her crazy. Always she'd been hesitant and insecure. The boldest thing she'd ever done was to go up to Peter Gross beside the ice house in the woods. And that was only possible because she'd pitied him and couldn't conceive of anything happening between them. How wrong she'd been. 2. Staro Selo. On Friday evenings, the officers lit candles in the dugouts. From the Roumanian trenches you could see the glow. At sunset, the Turkish guns would fall silent among the southern front from Balchik to Kula, a distance of 400 kilometers. General Antonescu and the Roumanian High Command had thought at first to take advantage of the superstition of the enemy. They had begun several big assaults on Saturday mornings, especially in the sectors closest to the river. Interrupted in their meditations, the Turks had fought with murderous fury. Later, the Roumanians, superstitious in their turn, would not budge from their positions for the entire Sabbath, fearful of the wrath, as they imagined, of an indignant god. This became the routine in the first season of the war, a day of respite at the end of every week. The bombardments would stop on both sides of the line, and the men would climb out of the trenches with ringing ears. They would repair their works, search in the barbed wire and cold mud for the bodies of their friends. At dusk on Saturday, the guns would open up, hesitant at first, just a few green flares and tracers taking range. And then it all would begin again. One Friday night in March, a man stood in the communication trench behind a quiet section of the line. This was south of the town of Staro Selo, where there was a supply depot and a military hospital, as well as the battalion headquarters. The man, a platoon leader from Theta Company, was not typical because he had risen from the ranks. In the winter he had served first as a private soldier, later as an NCO. But during the most recent counterattack, the 11th Mountain Battalion had lost 17 of its junior officers. The man had been promoted in the field to acting brevet captain, a rank that had not yet been either reconsidered or confirmed. He was atypical in another way. His right hand had been amputated at the middle of his forearm, forcing him to wear a prosthetic steel hook, buckled with leather straps to the stump of his arm. This injury had preceded the beginning of the war, which made his presence in the army a cause for speculation. But, as he had explained, an ape could have enlisted in the battalion during the first Turkish advance. No questions would have been asked. The captain was a handsome man, with curly brown hair and big, widely spaced white teeth. His name was Peter Gross. Now he stood listening in the deserted trench, a clean one, cut back and forth in a corkscrew pattern 150 meters from the support lines. The telephone wires were fastened to the walls or else held safely overhead. The drainage sumps were marked in white and full of tiny frogs. Underfoot, the mud was dry. 3 weeks earlier, the enemy had attacked under a creeping barrage, had driven the men back to the support trenches almost to the town. But the Turks had not been able to sustain their progress. Isolated in their turn by the Roumanian artillery, caught in fortifications they themselves had blown to pieces, and which in any case were facing the wrong way, they withdrew. After 2 days of fighting, both armies had collapsed into their previous positions. The 11th Brashov Mountaineers, responsible for this section of the line, had lost almost 500 men in 48 hours, most during the initial bombardment. Many had been buried alive. Now, after a period of inactivity, it was as if none of that had ever occurred. The trench ran straight and clean. The world was peaceful in the overcast, misty night. The captain was almost invisible. He stood, unnoticed, in an angle of the wall, listening to the cheeping frogs. It was as if the entire battlefront were deserted, or else patrolled by ghosts. Tomorrow the communication trenches would be full of soldiers bringing up supplies under shelter of the truce. Tonight, because of the impossibility of an attack, the discipline on this part of the line had been relaxed. The company commander, a martinet during the week, was on his 24-hour bender. A line of light slid from the bottom of the dugout's corrugated iron door. The men were playing cards. Behind the captain on the slope, the machine gun posts were empty. Covered in their tarpaulins and rubber capes, the men snored in their shelters, cut into the trench's inner wall. Nothing stirred. There would be observers in the listening posts. Captain Gross stepped across to the traverse, a sandbag buttress reinforced with timber at the level of his head. He climbed onto the fire steps and looked over the parapet. Nothing. No time like the present. He put his hand over his heart so he could feel the outline of the envelope he kept there, tucked under his shirt. A ritual in these moments. He clambered up the stepladder over the top. Then he was crawling on his belly over crusts of broken earth. After 50 meters, he rose to his hands and knees. The Turks had fortified positions in a wheat field beyond the remains of a dirt road and a shattered line of trees. The land between the armies was a tormented strip of earth, in some places no more than 100 meters wide. Peter Gross was interested in poetry, and at dangerous moments he would surrender to the poetical part of himself in order to achieve a kind of discipline. Tonight, this no-man's land was like a river to him, and he imagined a cold, furious stream that flowed down from the mountains to the sea, a metaphoric likeness to the Danube, 10 kilometers behind him, the border to Roumania, toward which the army now retreated in bloody fits and starts. Now that he had left the trench, he could smell the river on the night wind. On his hands and knees in the stiff dirt, he imagined the silent torrent all around him. The land was more like water than earth, carved ridges of mud and circular depressions, whirlpools of stinking garbage. Surely now in March the snows were melting in the high mountains, and in the Balkan mountains near Staro Selo. Surely there was snow in the mountains where Miranda lived, away from all this. Now the spring rains had brought a devastating flood, had washed away boots and hats and pieces of buildings, people too. Here the stream broadened as it met the plain. It stretched half a kilometer to the flickering candles on the far bank. Here especially there were mounds of detritus, clumps of grass and straw, timbers, broken trees, all stitched together in ubiquitous barbed wire, which held the flotsam, he thought, like an abandoned fishing net. Out of sight, from both banks of the stream, he clambered to his feet. He recognized the place. He stood on the lip of a small dell, an oak tree in the middle. This was the exact location. All was quiet here, as in the trenches. But there was no truce in no man's land, the broken strip of earth between the armies. Under cover of darkness, faces blackened with soot, Turks and Roumanians would patrol this ground, looking for their wounded and taking prisoners. On Wednesday night, Peter had taken 6 men on patrol. Past midnight, they had encountered a Turkish wiring detail. 1 man was missing when they returned to the line, a farmer's son named Kostake, 18 years old. Peter had gone out again with 2 volunteers, but had found nothing. The boy must have gotten lost. Several hundred meters to the left of Theta Company's positions, someone was shot by snipers climbing back. He shouted in Roumanian, but by that time the sun had risen. On Thursday, they had listened to him calling out for water. On Thursday night, Peter had tried to find him with the same two men, but they had been roughed up. Now, today, the boy hadn't made another sound, and Theta Company was pulled back in reserve. Even though it was Friday night and the guns were quiet, the company commander had refused permission for another attempt. So Peter had had to come up the communications trench and try from another section of the line. It was easy to get lost. He recognized this tree. This was where they'd seen the Turks 2 nights before. Pistols and knives in the darkness for about a minute. That was all they could manage so close to the line. What a stupid waste. All of a sudden it seemed crazy to him that he should think he'd find the boy alive, or even the boy's body. What could he do? There was no one here. It hadn't rained for almost a week, and that was hopeful, wasn't it? Spring was coming. He could smell the spring. This was the Bulgar country, famous for its fogs. As he climbed from the dell, he saw he was closer to the Turkish lines than he had thought. No more than 70 meters. He could see the candles glimmer in the mist. He wiped his face and found it wet. A wet wind from the river and the marsh. Moisture glistened on his sleeve. So it was good to have the candles as a point of reference. He put his back to them and picked his way over the wounded, pockmarked, cratered ground. He had a pair of clippers in his pocket, and he often had to stop to cut through the wire. It sagged from metal stakes that screwed into the earth, an African invention, he had heard. He was moving toward a lantern burning in the lines, which indicated the Roumanian latrines. It and the corresponding Turkish light were never shelled, by mutual and silent understanding. Now it flickered in the mist, flickered, and went out. But the distances were short. It was important to find the right section of the trench, the right traverse. Omega Company held 200 meters of the front. The CO was notorious for his laxness on Friday nights, and Peter knew some of the men. He muttered a curse in the English language. Had they blown out the lantern? Or was it hidden in the mist, which might still rise? All was in darkness, and he could feel the warm wind on his face. Behind him, the Sabbath candles had gone out. The barbed wire was around his waist. He sank to his knees, then pulled himself forward into a shallow crater. Without the light from the latrine, it was useless to blunder forward. Should he wait for dawn? No. Even before dawn, the trenches would be full of men. Darkness was his only chance to get back to his tent unnoticed. And so he crept forward into holes punched out of the earth by the crashing howitzers, the whining 75s. Many of them contained corpses, slimy or half-eaten by the rats. What was the point of searching for one corpse among the thousands who had died here? Was it because of his own vanity, his reputation on the line? When the darkness cleared a little bit and he could see his reference lights, he would give up and go back. He paused, lifted up his head. Why did he find it necessary to disregard his senior officers? Was he hoping for some kind of wound or punishment so he could escape this place? Or was he trying to punish himself, maybe, and to forget how he had left Miranda Popescu in Cizmigiu Park in Bucharest, abandoned a duty as clear as anything in Staro Selo? Otherwise he would think about her all night long. He had abandoned her. Now he was stuck here in the mud, trapped with 100,000 others, and there was nothing to be done. And so he continued onward on his hands and knees, because he was quite sure he was in the area where Kostake had been hit. He was moving parallel to the trench as far as he could judge. Here was a deep, broken shell hole, and he could smell the water at the bottom. Here he found his man, lying on his back at the top of the crater, asleep, unconscious, dead. He put his hand on his shoulder. He whispered in his ear. And he was alive. He came awake and would have shouted, only Peter put his hand over his mouth. He was struggling as Peter pinned him, held him down with his right elbow on his neck, the steel hook in his face. Why, if he had this much strength, had he not called out to the men in the listening post so they could bring him in? And so Peter knew immediately this wasn't his boy at all. His hair was tight and curly, close to his scalp. But was the man a Turk? A spy? After his first surprise, when he'd been startled out of sleep, he did not struggle or cry out. He lay tense and terrified under Peter's hook. And whether his eyes had adjusted or else some of the mist had cleared, now Peter could see he was hurt. His boot protruded at an angle, and he was grimacing and stiff with pain. Nor was he dressed in the green tunic of the 11th Mountaineers, but in the black uniform of another Transylvanian regiment, the 53rd Light Infantry. He had his service badge. Peter let his hand roam over the man's body, ascertaining all this. Now he thought he could risk a flame, and so he brought his Turkish lighter from his pocket and flicked the wheel next to the man's cheek, just for a moment. Men rubbed soot or burned cork on their faces when they went on these patrols, but this man was an African. Peter had heard a rumor there were soldiers under the protection of the non-combatant states that made this crossing. He had not believed it. "Who are you?" he whispered next to the fellow's hairless cheek. He adjusted his elbow so the man could talk. He was small in any case, small-boned and weak. His voice, when it came, was soft and cultured, aristocratic. He spoke Roumanian without an accent. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Thank God, I have been lying here. Dreams. I dreamt and told myself I must have fallen near my grandfather's farm in Săcele, and I have scratched myself in the wet briars. So many cows have come this way. The ground is broken up. I must have put my foot into a rabbit hole. Oh, I think I will die in this place. There is no excuse for me." So, delirious. Săcele was a town near Brașov, north of Bucharest. The Count de Gratz had had a hunting lodge near there. Suddenly it seemed idiotic to Peter Gross that he was even here. To own or control the no-man's land was an advantage mostly in the mind. But men died for it even when there was no fighting, died or went mad. The colonel believed in these patrols because he thought they kept the soldiers sharp during periods of inactivity. He rarely visited the front line. "What is your name?" Peter whispered. "Janus Adira, sir, of the 53rd Wolf Company, with dispatches. I ask you, is it possible to stay here on this hillside? If I call out, who will listen? Oh, but I will die in this place, brought down like an animal." Peter looked up at the sky. The light was changing, and there was evidence of a moon. Dispatches. What was he talking about? "Don't say anything," Peter said. "You'll be fine. You're not 50 meters from the trench. Morning comes, then you cry out. They'll bring you in under the truce." "Ah, God, don't leave me. Don't say these things. You are Captain Gross. I recognize you. I've heard of you. Theta Company, from the 11th. They will shoot me or else hang me because I am a brave man, an idealist and a student of liberty. This is not for my own sake." So he was a spy, Peter thought. No doubt under some kind of indirect protection. Officially, the Abyssinians were neutral in this war. He raised his head above the crater's lip. He could see the latrine lantern now, back the way he'd come. "Captain Gross, don't leave me," whispered Janus Adira. "If I lie here by myself, oh, God." At the university, sometimes we would argue these things. No, I would hear them argue these modern points of view, picked up from German texts. I thought I could believe them. I prayed to God I could believe them, that death was like a soft sleep. That's all. He swallowed, started again. "My leg. I tell you I have broken my leg. Oh, it hurts, I tell you. I was saying the same things. Except the more beer I drank, the more I realized they were fools. Now I tell you I believe in everything. The hidden world, the country of the dead. What else is possible? In these trenches everyone has seen the cockroaches and vermin erupt out of the earth. So I wonder what kind of animal or insect will come from my own corpse when I am lying below the gallows or against the wall." Peter cursed under his breath. It was bad luck the man had recognized him. Now, as he tried to pull away, the corporal grabbed him by the sleeve. "Please, you must save me. They have given me directions to go to Kieselet, to the wreck of the Hephaestion. Please, I will pay you what you ask. Whatever you ask. I am not a traitor." Tears were on his cheeks. Peter could see them now. The light was better. Damn it, he thought. The man would cry out if he left. He was sure to cry out. He pressed his elbow against Adira's throat, cutting off the flow of words. God damn it! Adira had called him by his name, known his name, and could identify him. Now the man lay still. But what had he said about Kieselet and the Hephaestion? What did he know about that? He turned Adira onto his side, watched him vomit in shock and pain. "Give me a break," Peter muttered in English. But he had already decided to bring him in, for Kostaki's sake. He did not want to return empty-handed after a night like this. And so, because there was no other option, he gave up all attempt at secrecy or stealth. He dragged the soldier up and staggered to his feet. He pulled him up across his chest, crushed him against his chest, and the man was quiet at last. He was very small, very light. It was like carrying a child. Peter climbed out of the crater and along the ridge thrown up by the shell. Adira hung from his arms. Maybe he'd lost consciousness. Peter had given up the idea of sneaking or dissembling. It was too late for that. But he would trust the drunkenness of Omega Company's commander and stagger back to the line toward the traverse where he'd started. He'd brazen it out, but as he came up to the trench, maybe he needn't have worried. A soldier saw him as he loomed out of the darkness. "Oh, it's Captain Gross. Good morning, sir." Then, later, "Should I bring a stretcher? Give him here. Trust me, sir." "No, I'll take him back." He climbed onto the traverse timber, crossing the trench as if over a 5-centimeter bridge. The sky had gone gray, and he could see where he was going, so he strolled back toward the support line over the open ground, Adira in his arms. He walked parallel to the communication trench. "Hi, Captain. Where are you going?" called a man from the machine gun post behind the line. "I'll see you before dark." This was agricultural land, or had been, all the way to Staro Selo. Ruined buildings, a farm. Past the third trench, Peter laid his burden in the mud behind the shelter of a stone wall. There had been an orchard here. "Now," he said, "tell me what you're doing." Adira turned his face to the side. "No more lies," Peter said. "Talk to me." He squatted down and slid his hook into Adira's neck just above his breastbone. Delicately, with the point of his prosthesis, he unbuttoned the front of Adira's tunic. "I felt this before. I wonder what it is." In the afternoon, Peter's company would return to the front line, and there were rumors of a push. He had no time to waste here, but he was curious about the envelope over Adira's heart. Was it the same as his? A memento, a talisman, a good luck charm? Peter didn't think so. With his left hand he unfolded it, opened it up. Underneath, tucked into Adira's undershirt, was a wad of Reichmarks. This was what the man had meant when he had talked about paying him. The paper on the inside of the envelope was sky blue with threads of silk. There were pages of hieroglyphs drawn in gold. Andromeda might have been able to read them, Peter thought. So, an African carrying messages from Africa. Under the bare trees in the dead, long grass, the world was calm. Corporal Adira, if that was really his name, was sniveling because of his broken leg. But even that was a hopeless little noise. There were birds in the branches above Peter's head, and in the dawn light, on the hill south of the town, He could see the battery come to life, the men pulling the howitzers out of their pens. It was quiet in that wood behind the line, the day-long hush before the evening thunder.
"Tell me what this says," he said. I don't know. It is from Abyssinia. I can see that. You don't know what it says?"
Peter removed the wad of currency.
"Where are you taking this?"
"To Brashov, sir. Dispatches. The money is for my sister and my mother, not for myself. I swear it."
Peter wrinkled up his nose.
"And you're from Abyssinia?"
"Yes.
No, my father. And you think this will help?"
Yes, I do. Yes, sir. Something must be done."
"I wonder."
Around them the day was gathering. The men on the hill were unwrapping the long muzzles of the 75mm cannons. Peter Gross looked up.
30 years ago, we marched through this country carrying rifled muskets with percussion caps. Now we have machine guns and grenades. From Africa, but they supply both sides. It's for the money, don't you think? I don't know. That's what I think. It's too much money to resist."
They spoke in murmurs behind the ruined wall. The trees above them were full of little birds that suddenly took flight, turning all at once. Now a single long shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds. Deep in the east, the light came slipping toward them over the broken fields and the remains of last year's harvest.
"I'm going back," said Captain Gross. "I'll turn this over to my colonel. He'll send someone to pick you up." "Please, sir, no. For the love of God. It's about Kieselet. The accident at Kieselet. This is an investigation by the government at Addis Ababa. That's all. I swear to God."
Peter turned the papers over, examined the backs of them.
"What do you know about Kieselet?" "Nothing, sir. I'm just a messenger." Peter laughed. "And not a good one. You're not the right man for this."
He dropped the wad of money in the dirt. The little man, still weeping, lying on his side, clutched at it feebly.
"No, sir."
Peter got to his feet. He brushed off the knees of his trousers, stood for a moment squinting into the wide sun, sniffing at the air. From here, looking north toward the great river, you almost wouldn't know there was a war. He turned and walked away through the orchard toward the communication trench. He would inform the military police after he'd returned to Theta Company. In the meantime, he was being followed. He recognized the scent first of all, an animal and human mixture. In cheap hotels across North Africa and the Levant, he'd gotten used to it. Now he sniffed it with an odd sense of nostalgia, rank and appealing, heavy and light. There had been a time when it had disgusted him. Those also had been difficult days, but difficult or not, now they seemed touched with gold, with the warm morning light that caressed every pre-war memory, everything that had happened before the Turks had crossed the line. He turned and lifted up his nose, waiting for her to take shape somewhere in the dead weeds. Dog, woman, or man. Standing over the idiotic spy, her name had occurred to him. Was that when he had first caught the scent? Maybe not, because he thought about her often, her and Miranda Popescu. Every hour, maybe more.
"Where are you?" he whispered. "Behind you."
Her harsh, queer voice. Maybe she crouched on the other side of the stone wall, but he heard her clearly.
"Don't turn around," she said.
They spoke in English.
"What do you want?" "Just to see you, first of all. You're a hard man to find alone." "I must go back," he said. Then, after a moment, "How is Miranda? Is she safe?" She didn't answer him. "I have a favor to ask, for old time's sake. Past times in the 9th Hussars." They had served together under General Schenk von Schenk, Miranda's father. That's where they'd known each other first. So long ago it seemed like the beginning of the world. "Yes, I know you're having trouble with conscriptions, all the Transylvanian battalions. I want to know if I could volunteer, and you could bring me in."
Now suddenly he remembered that old campaign, the sights and sounds conjured to life, as if by a few harsh, toneless words. The smell of leather and horses when they were camping in the birch trees above Nova Zagora. Brandy around the fire. The view from the ridge when, on horseback, he had taken his men down. Not like now, cowering in a hole.
"You're crazy," he said.
Then, because she didn't answer, he went on.
"We're not soldiers anymore. We're up against machines, machines stuck in the mud. You know, like those Terminator movies?"
It was too tempting not to make a little joke, to bring back something from the other past they shared, when they had been kids together in Berkshire County. And she laughed.
"No," he said again. "You're crazy."
She was laughing. "Please, don't make this hard. I beg you. Think of that. I'm begging you.
Take me as a private soldier under your command."
He understood it must be true. This must be hard for her to say. She had not loved him then, nor did she love him now. She'd been a lieutenant in the old days, Sasha Prochenko, on a big white stallion, so dashing and romantic in his forest green uniform, high boots, fawn-colored pants, so popular with the ladies, his blue eyes flecked with silver, and later at Mamaia Castle on the beach.
"No, this is not a place for you. It's not what we need. How could you pass the physical?"
When she said nothing, he continued.
"Can you see yourself in a latrine with 20 men?
That made her pause.
I had not thought you were so cruel."
He looked around. Her voice had changed, and she was closer.
"What about your own physical exam?" she asked. "Or were you always Captain Hook?"
Then again,
"I am begging you."
"No!" he cried, angry now. Morning had come. There was no time.
"Wasn't it your job to stay with Miranda and protect her? Isn't that what we decided? What we agreed on in Chismigiu Park? I wish that was my job, not to die here in this place. This cesspit."
Now he could see her in the morning sunlight. She stood up on the other side of the wall. She climbed over between the tumbled stones. Always the dandy. Civilian clothes, her pants perfectly creased. She carried a silver-headed cane. She had a way that both attracted and repulsed him. But he had seen no women for many months, and his heart lifted when he saw her. She was too exotic for mere beauty. Her yellow hair under the slouch hat, the soft body hair that made her exposed skin seem to glow, the proud expression and strong features in which her animal nature now seemed to predominate. But the sharp, musky smell had disappeared. He was used to it already. Though she was dressed as a man, and in spite of the dog or wolf that lurked inside of her, she looked more girlish or womanly than she ever had in Berkshire County. Her hair was longer now, curling down below her ears.
"It doesn't seem so bad," she said, looking around at the quiet orchard, the guns on the hillside raising their muzzles to the sky. "It's a beautiful sight," she persisted. "You'd better go. A girl can dream." But now Peter wanted to stay a moment longer. "Promise me you'll go back to her. This is not the place for you. The Contessa de Rougemont. In Bucharest, we had no choice except for her to take Miranda in. But do you remember her on the Husik River bank? Young woman then, old lady now. The place stank of magic."
Andromeda gave him a blank look. She didn't remember. How could she remember?
"I don't trust her," he went on, "no matter what Madame de Grotte says. I wish I could. No, leave a message at the hospital. Will you do that? There's a corporal of the 53rd Light Infantry over in those trees. He's got a broken leg. And tell me," he continued, "what does this say?"
He thrust the envelope of hieroglyphs into her gloved hand.
She didn't need to squint to read it. This is a shopping list. Small arms. Sure, said Peter. Is that all? No, it's not all. Kieselet. Do you remember Kieselet? She smiled, then went on. You weren't yourself. Neither was I. But I saw those lead canisters in the baggage car. That's what they're talking about here. Peter shrugged. Andromeda raised the paper to her nose and sniffed it. They must have been blown up in the explosion, she said, except for one. An Abyssinian in a gray suit. He crawled out to die south of the tracks. I took the suit, his money, and his watch. But I left the canister 200 meters in the marsh. A dead oak tree. You could see from the embankment. Everything else was to the north. Peter scratched his right forearm where the leather cuff chafed. He had his own memories of that day and the wreck of the Hephaestion. From there he'd gone to Mogoshwaya, where he'd found Miranda Popescu. Tell me, he said, though by now it was too late to listen. How is everyone in Stanesh Juai? How is she? He spoke the name of the village like a charm. It was impossible to send a letter, though he had written many, or else the same one over and over. Tell me, is she safe? Andromeda smiled, cruel in her turn, he thought. Her teeth were sharp and numerous. You'd better go. And then, after a moment, in any case, I've been in Bucharest. Don't tell me you haven't seen her, Peter said. Promise me you'll watch over her. Is that too much to ask while I am here? Inés de Rougemont. I saw her on the Husik River, dressed in gypsy clothes. Since then I've told myself that was not real. Madame de Gratz had vouched for her, her oldest friend. She talks about her in her letters, but how can I be sure? Promise me you'll go there now. For a moment there was no irony or slyness in her face. But she was as he remembered her, his old comrade in arms. Give her this, he said. He unbuttoned the first buttons of his tunic, then took from an inside pocket the letter he rewrote every 4th day or so, whenever they pulled his platoon from the front line. He kept it over his heart, a piece of superstition. I have a rendezvous with death, he quoted fiercely. It's lucky I learned that one, isn't it? It had been a favorite poem of his mother's in Berkshire County, a battle poem from the First World War. Now he said it for effect, something Sasha Prochenko might be expected to understand. Jealous, he supposed, she smiled at him. It's true. You are the lucky one. I often think about what happened in Kieselet. Standing in front of him, she took hold of his collar, brushed her fingers against his silver captain's bars. She held his letter in her other hand, along with the hieroglyphic message, which she'd refolded carefully, replaced in its envelope. No, give it back, Peter said. I changed my mind. It is not good for me to write to her. That's not what I promised to her father. I said I would protect her, not— His voice dribbled away. Andromeda supplied the rest. Care for her? It's not the worst thing. Was she teasing him? Peter turned his head. He stood looking out over the field. Madame de Gratz told me not to write to her. She told me it was dangerous, because I was a wanted man. She told me the police were looking for me. I haven't seen any proof. I'll take your letter, said Andromeda. No, I don't want that, Peter said. He reached out for the 2 envelopes, and she came to him. She tucked them into the inside pocket of his uniform. She patted him over his heart, buttoned him up. Though he was uncomfortable to feel her so close, he did not step away or knock her hands away. He had refused her, after all, rejected her. Her animal scent came back to him, and he could smell the liquor on her breath. He turned back toward the trench. It was only a couple of minutes later, after she was gone, that he realized she had picked his pocket, taken both envelopes.
the letter to Miranda, and the pages of hieroglyphs. She'd left him with nothing. 3. Lieutenant Prochenko. I Have a Rendezvous with Death was published in a chapbook with a dozen other poems after the war. Edited by a captain of the 11th, it included Dolce et Decorum, If I Should Die, and even When I Have Fears That I Might Cease to Be. Lieutenant Prochenko, though, riding back to Bucharest in a second-class compartment, hadn't known what Peter was talking about. What kind of rendezvous? The lieutenant had never been a student of English poetry, either in his high school days in Massachusetts or at his boarding school in Chisinau. He would have had no patience for Peter Gross's literary ambitions, even if he'd known about them. Caught in his own troubles as the train crept into the Gare du Nord, he had no inkling of events as they transpired. The Second Battle of Staro Selo. But already that night the Turks had used chlorine gas in their assault. An African invention, born on the wind, it had killed hundreds on both sides. Prochenko had heard the barrage from the station, and for hours afterwards. Now, thankfully, they had passed beyond the thunder of the guns. Anyone with a map could see that Staro Selo was the fulcrum of the war, 10 kilometers from the bridge at Tutrakan, another 60 to Bucharest. Captain Gross would win the Star of Hercules for what he already had accomplished in his trench full of poisoned, dying men. Peering out the window at the city lights, Prochenko might have found himself consumed with jealous disappointment if he'd known. It had always been his habit to condescend to Peter Gross. But what could he do now? Every compartment, every station platform was full of men in uniform. All of them stared at him as if he were some kind of circus freak. At Vasilati, he had given his seat to a man on crutches and gone to stand in the crowded corridor. There it was worse. Men pressed against him on either side as the train shuddered and swayed. Couldn't they tell he was different from them? Perhaps they could. That was what was so painful. When the track attendant in Bucharest unlocked the doors and pulled down the steps, Prochenko stood against the black, cold windows to let them all pass. But there was still a crowd when he followed. There was always a crowd. Men were waiting at a tea stall on the platform, dressed in mud-brown sappers' uniforms, waiting for the train to take them south. He imagined what they were thinking as he strode through them in his calfskin boots, up the stairs and into the great hall of the station. Weak heart, weak lungs, mentally deficient, a sodomite perhaps. But if they only knew. Sometimes he was tempted to affect a limp or a damaged arm. No, he had too much pride for that. His wounds were on the inside. And so he faked an easy, casual saunter. Under the gleaming mosaic dome, he paused to light a cigarette, hooking his wolf's head walking stick over his arm and stripping off his gloves. There was the row of itching bites along his wrist, where the demon had bitten him. He checked the times for the train to Rumnicu at the departure board, the first part of his journey to the mountains. All those old women together, and Miranda. In his jacket's breast pocket he carried Peter Gross's letter, which he would bring to her. He was tempted to read it. Why not? Lazy curiosity. He had his own adventures. He scratched the sores along his wrist, making them bleed under the soft white hair. Hours to kill. The train wasn't till late morning. It was close to dawn. Domnul, sir. Are you looking for something? Vous cherchez quelque chose? The boy at the newspaper kiosk was talking to him. He had a sheep's big eyes. Prochenko was looking for something. The world was falling apart. There was no news in the papers, but a clever man could see the shortages and misery in every story, even the most desperately optimistic. Elena Popescu, the president's wife, had hosted a grand cotillion in the People's Palace. In Poland, where the Germans and Russians fought each other in the endless woods, there was no progress of any kind. He strode out into the piazza and the street. God, hours to kill. And because this was Bucharest, the sapphire city with its marble buildings and blue-tiled domes, and because he had just seen Elena Popescu's name in print, he knew the demon would find him. It was a question of time. A debutante's cotillion with only 17 names. How sad that was. The first time he had attended an event like that, in the dress uniform of the 9th Hussars, there had been 3 times that number. Long-necked swans with white gloves up their arms. But that was more than 20 years ago. He wore a light linen jacket and no overcoat, and in the raw, foggy hour before dawn, he was not cold. On the contrary, he spat into the gutter. The train had been intolerable. Always, when he was overheated, he found his mouth filling up with saliva. It wasn't normal. He was always a couple of degrees warmer than the rest. For 10 minutes, the lieutenant strolled along the boulevard toward the center of town. These streets were deserted, dark. The shutters of the shops were closed. He would be easy to find. At a corner of the street, under a portico, he stopped to light another cigarette. A small, intermittent beacon, he supposed. What should he do? What should he do now? Almost without thinking, he drew the envelope of hieroglyphs out of his inside pocket. Why had he stolen it? Just out of malice, he supposed, and because sometimes he imagined that in Kieselet might lie the key to his triple nature. Now, disgusted with himself, he crumpled up the ornate pages, dropped them into the wet gutter. In fact, he had no use for them. It was the other letter that concerned him, Peter's letter to Miranda Popescu. If Captain Gross thought he could shame Prochenko into babysitting her in her mountain safe house, well, then maybe there was shame enough for both of them. And maybe Prochenko could bring Miranda something she cared about, something to share with her, some new piece of information. He wouldn't let Peter Gross humiliate him. He broke the seal, opened the envelope. He held the cigarette between his lips, and by the light of occasional matches, he read Peter's schoolboy script. Both he and Miranda wrote in the same childish cursive. It was a love letter. It was not long. There was nothing poetical about it. Grey wolf, Prochenko thought. But still, the letter filled him with emotion, and he would go into Rumniku, and he would do what he had promised. How strange it was, though, that he had to act as Peter Gross's proxy in this matter, protecting Miranda from threats he could not claim to understand. He had no independent recollection of events along the Husik riverbank. Vague wisps of color and distress. No, Peter's urgency had nothing to do with that. If, brooding at Staro Selo over the winter, he realized he had joined his regiment more out of panic than self-sacrifice, or, God help him, patriotism, now he was trapped just the same. Now, it was obvious from the letter, he was afraid he'd missed his chance to tell Miranda how he felt. Carefully, almost reverently, Prochenko refolded the single page and slid it back into its envelope. He replaced it in his pocket and then stood smoking his cigarette. He was expecting his own small manifestation of love. He didn't have long to wait. There it was above him in the round vault, perched on a protruding brick. It sat in a meditative pose, tiny fist under its chin, wings folded. Then it fell forward in a somersault, tumbling forward into the air, drifting down and down. Prochenko held his breath. He waited, a smile on his gray lips, and with his face inclined upward, he let out a stream of smoke. Light and flimsy, the creature shied away, disturbed, as Prochenko imagined, by the small, hot, poisonous current of air. "Go," Prochenko said. "Vas-y. You know what I want." The creature, a naked boy just a few centimeters tall, made kicking, swimming motions and flapped its evanescent wings. Buffeted by every change of air, it started on its way. As it rose into the pale sky, Prochenko wondered, not for the first time, how it could fly so fast, so far on its unsteady course. This he knew. By the time he had reached Tineretului Park and Belu Cemetery, it would have crossed the city to the Strada Italiana, to Elena Popescu's house, or else found a way to reach her in the People's Palace. and he had no intention of dawdling, nor would he take a streetcar from the Piazza Universitati. But while the streets were still empty, he would run the 7 kilometers or so. It would feel good to run. He would not stop or draw breath. He would catch some pleasure from the strangeness of his body and arrive unwinded in an hour. Less than that, except he would take the long way round, find the empty industrial or residential streets. But first he stripped off his jacket, stripped off his boots and socks, and tied them in a package underneath his arm, together with his stick and hat. His feet would be quick and clever on the cobblestones. He spat into the gutter, then started off down the alley toward the Dąbrowica River and the promenade. At such moments his body felt like a furnace to him, flaring and dirty, needing no stoking. But inside there was a metal that could not be rarefied, that separated often into its 3 component elements. How was it possible, he thought, that Peter Gross could have found a way to keep himself whole? He was lucky to have lost his arm. How was it possible that Miranda had grown into a woman, while day by day Prochenko split apart? And yet in the beginning of this adventure, he was the one who had found his way while they seemed helpless, even though his path was the most difficult. In time the separate parts of them had healed, and they had grown toward each other too. What was in the love letter Peter Gross had given him? What was the feeling underneath the words? He thought he knew. There was a mist on the river as he loped along the embankment. The still water cast up reflections of the narrow Gothic houses, built in the previous century. Their stone facades were pitted with coal and charcoal smoke. The wrought iron fence along the promenade was stained and green. People came trudging down the streets, their scarves over their heads, a city of women and old men on their way to work. Special streetcars would take them out to the suburban factories for the morning shift. Mouths agape, they turned to watch him as he ran past. If only they knew. He ran east along the Strada Lipscani, then turned south. By the time he reached the park, the light was in the sky. What was Elena doing now? What excuses was she making to secretaries and servants? Would she come in the limousine? But it would take time, and he was glad to be here early. He crossed the street under the trees. She would know the place. They had met here several times in the previous year. It was a pleasure, he admitted, to make her take such risks. Why should he be the only one? But he had learned to damage what he hated, damage what he loved. He was the one who had killed Nicola Ceausescu, after all, murdered her when she stood vulnerable and exposed outside her own apartment in the People's Palace. At the time, he had imagined doing what he did for the sake of Great Romania, because the baroness had been an evil woman who had destroyed many with her schemes. Even so, because the Tsar loved her, and the Sultan might have learned to love her, perhaps she could have avoided this great war. And President Boku was obviously worse, a criminal without a grain of sentiment. Prochenko stood before the gates of Belu Cemetery, under the trees. Almost canine in his obsession with his own guilt, he had come often to this place. The gate was locked, but he knew a hole behind the bushes where the wall was broken down. First, he found a park bench and a square of raked gravel. He wiped his bleeding feet, pulled on his boots. He swept his hair back from his forehead, affixed his hat at a precise angle, put on his jacket. And with his cane in his hand, he climbed in among the headstones, once more a jaunty and dapper man about town. The light was breaking through the clouds. No one who had seen him running through the streets, his tongue protruding over his bright teeth, would have recognized him now, and no one would think, to watch him stroll idly down the rows of tombs, that he knew where he was going. But in a corner of the wall under the linden trees, a new mausoleum had been built. The first tomb in this plot belonged to the old Baron Ceausescu, once a deputy prime minister of Romania, who had taken his own life 14 years before. Loaded with debt, his widow had spared every expense. Not for him a grand celebration in the temple of his ancestors in Cluj. Instead, she had trundled him in here under a simple stone that, nevertheless, took on a little dignity because of its surroundings now. The Baron had died penniless and bankrupt,
estranged from his own family. Now beside him lay his only child, the dirt still rough over his grave. But the statue was eloquent, an image of Niobe weeping for her children. And in the stone face of the unfortunate mother, a careful observer could discern an echo of the Baroness's beautiful features. One of the stone hands reached out to a simple marker, cut with the young Baron's name and dates. Felix Ceausescu, dead before his 15th birthday. But the other was thrown backward, as if in a fit of grief, and the pointed finger indicated another stone set against the bottom of the wall. There was no name or number there, and the lieutenant wondered whether there might come a time when no one would appreciate the significance of the gesture or the unmarked grave. How long would it take before all the witnesses to the events were dead? How long before it was impossible for any student of history to learn that the elaborate tomb of Kevin Markasev in Banyasa was empty, or else the wrong corpse was buried there under the wrong dates? No, the unfortunate boy lay here instead. The lieutenant closed his eyes. Would there come a time also when no one but he would know the truth of how Nicola Ceausescu died? That while her proxy had destroyed itself on the stage of the ambassadors, she had been savaged in her own suite of rooms in the People's Palace, torn apart, murdered by a wild beast? At moments he could not but remember the sight of Kevin Markasev bleeding in his rented room in the Strada Camate, beaten out of recognition by the Baroness's hired assassin. Though she had not paid him, doubtless. It was not her way. Doubtless, also, it was a kind of ironic masochism that had brought Prochenko here, made him choose this place for his rendezvous. What had Peter Gross said? "I have a rendezvous with death." To clear his mind of the bloody image, and to purge himself of any painful and embarrassing self-reflection, he turned now to the Baroness's mausoleum. She had set herself apart from the other members of her family, away from the wall. There was a circle of gravel around the structure, and Prochenko sauntered around it, flicking at the pebbles with his cane, but little thoughts still picked at him. Why had he come here? Why had he sent that demon on its errand? Was there any part of what he did now that was motivated by love or loyalty? Or was he looking for people to suffer as he suffered? Sometimes he reassured himself by thinking he'd avenged Kevin Markasev after all, torn his murderer apart. But there was nothing noble in that either. It calmed him and cooled him to admire the little tomb, designed by the Baroness herself. She was a woman of many gifts. The drawings had been discovered after her death. They depicted a high-domed circular structure decorated with fluted columns and alabaster screens. Delicate spires gave the exterior a spiky and forbidding look, which was softened by a pattern of carved marble, a motif that suggested flowers and vines and shaded bowers without actually representing them. All the ornamentation was abstract, a complicated shell that was more light and space and air than stone, but which still served to protect the image inside. It was a life-sized bronze casting of the Baroness, standing naked and erect, head high, arms at her sides, legs slightly spread. There was no art or coquetry in the pose. The artist had worked from a sheaf of photographic images that the Baroness had made during the last year of her life, standing naked before the big box camera with the bulb under her toe. She had made many hundreds of exposures without sparing the most intimate parts of her body or making any attempt to flatter herself. The photographs had not been reproduced or distributed, and the statue, though designed for public display, was perfectly concealed by the tomb's ornamentation. The archways that pierced the structure were too narrow, the screens that surrounded it too fine to admit more than an occasional stray glimpse of a shoulder, knee, eye, or hand. Some onlookers imagined a mournful expression, some an attitude of brazenness that matched the metal of the statue. But it was impossible not to take away an impression of constraint, of an animal inside a cage, or a prisoner inside a cell, which was the Baroness's intention, revealed in a letter that accompanied the design. No, but it was lucky she had taken the photographs. Her dead body had been so damaged, no artist could have worked from it. Prochenko took no comfort from the fact, no comfort from reflecting on any of this. The doubts still snatched at him,
Why had he summoned Elena Popescu to this place? Was it to express a feeling or a need? Or was it to demonstrate the forces that constrained or imprisoned her as well, imprisoned both of them? No, it was not generous, not kind to make her take such risks. The cemetery was public, after all. The gates would open at 10 o'clock, but the tumbled section of the wall was not a secret. No, he would not do this to her. He would remove his boots and run away. But he would leave something, perhaps a handkerchief or a glove here at the tomb where a marble plaque was set into the step. Nicola Ceausescu, and then a simple line indenture of a tiger. Many others, after all, had left their keepsakes here: flowers, candles, letters, coins. He dropped the glove and turned away, but then he heard a voice behind him. "Oh!" It was a habit she had, and he couldn't tell if it affected him or irritated him. But when she first saw him, and later when he kissed her, she gave at intervals a little breathless gasp, as if he'd pricked her, or hurt her, or deflated her suddenly. Now, ambushed when it had been his intention to run away, irritation was uppermost. He strode toward her through the tombstones down the gravel path. She must have taken the limousine. "Oh, I had a premonition you were here. Oh, I'm so glad." A premonition? Was she trying to make a fool of him? She was wearing her hat and veil and long lavender coat. Without preamble, he thrust his naked hand in through the buttons and opened it, crushing her to him, forcing the little gasp from her. There on the flushed skin over her collarbone, a row of bites. But she was laughing as she submitted. She never pulled away. He lifted the veil, kissed her, covered her charming little mouth while she was trying to talk. "I can't stay. Just a minute," etc. And was it possible to have her here among the graves, or else bring her back to the shelter of Ceausescu's tomb? He pulled her up the little slope while she was laughing and pretending to resist. Could he actually possess her here as thoroughly as his woman's body would allow? On the step beside the baroness's gravestone, he pushed her down, pushed his hands beyond the slit in her skirt and into her underwear, while she opened her mouth to him, leaned back, surrendered her breasts to his other hand. Her body was so cool and fresh and young. Part of him wanted to punish her for coming, for yielding to him against her best interests, which was neither fair nor good. Had he always been like this? He couldn't remember. But there was another part that yearned to please her, and he supposed it was the combination that squeezed that little breathless gasp from her. She was not this way with everyone, not with her pig of a husband, Bocul, as they called him in the graffiti near the river. How old was she? Scarcely 20 years. "Oh, you're burning me," she said. "You have a fever." She was used to it. Ever since the accident at Kieselet, his flesh had been on fire. He burned like a dog in heat, something like that. And why was he even thinking about dogs? It was because he heard a barking dog, an Alsatian by the sound. It was barking by the wall. "Come with me," he muttered into her neck. It was obvious she had been followed. Obvious, but not to her. "Oh," she said. He was pulling her up, and she would not come. She was laughing as if this were a game. She had her arms around him. How could she be so stupid? He snarled at her and wrenched himself away. He would not be caught like this, not in this trap, though it was clear already that whatever happened, it would be his fault. And he could smell them now, the oiled leather of their boots. Boku's thugs from the Brankovanu artillery, a private regiment of bully boys and torturers, whose barracks were in the city. He could smell them now, their frightened farts and dirty fingers. He could hear their shouts and whistles, and Elena heard them too. "Go," she said. She got to her feet and tottered off down the row of stones without looking back. A brave girl, a champion who deserved better. And there was no place to go. They would have secured the outer circuit of the wall. But he had some tricks up his sleeves. He was different from ordinary men, which was both a burden and a gift.
No normal person could fit between the slender columns of the baroness's tomb, slid in through the narrow arch. No one was so supple or so oddly jointed. But in just a dozen seconds, he was in the hidden sanctuary, his body thrust against the bronze-naked statue. His nose was full of the stone and metal smell. He was straining to listen. Whoever it was had come into the cemetery and was guiding Elena back. Prochenko could hear the murmur of the conversation. He was listening for the bark or the snuffle of the dog not far away. He could hear Elena's voice now, and her husband's voice. He recognized it from the radio broadcasts, a forthright, manly tenor. There was even some laughing, as if at some small joke which was Boku's way. The posters on the boulevards showed him in poses that were not traditionally inspirational. He was always smiling, for one thing. A man in his 50s, powerfully built, with short hair and a gray mustache. He was not tall. Prochenko saw him in his mind's eye as he was straining to decipher the language of the dog, saw the amused, ironical expression that could not hide the coarseness and cruelty of his jaw and mouth, saw his gray or cream-colored uniform without any military insignia. Where was the dog? Did someone have him on a short lead? There was a strangled desperation to the barking now, and Prochenko could hear him scratching at the steps of the tomb. The beast could smell him, he was sure. No, there he was. There was his nose snuffling at the screen. So Prochenko spoke a word in a soft voice of command, a tone beyond the frequency of human ears. He scarcely had to make a sound. The beast knew who his master was. Suddenly there was a baffled whine, and the dog pulled away, ceased his barking, and Prochenko could hear the murmured conversation. Elena was going to pull it off. This was an unlikely place for a romantic assignation. It was not a hotel, or a restaurant, or a parked automobile. There were other more likely explanations for her presence, which were, he couldn't guess, but then he heard Colonel Boku laugh and say, "And what is this? Your glove?" It was not her glove, Prochenko knew. It was a man's leather glove still damp with sweat. He couldn't hear Elena's voice, but the man laughed again. No, I don't think so. Unless your hands have grown. We will see what Rex thinks of these. Rex, what is wrong with you? Thank you, Sergeant. Ah, you see here in the bushes we have found a walking stick, a hat, a linen coat, every part of a man except for one. Where is he, please? He spoke Roumanian even to his wife. It was an element in his political program, the reintroduction of Roumanian at all levels of society, the prohibition of English and especially French. And his voice, tense, light, musical, was also compelling. "Oh, no," he said. "No, I don't think so." What would he do to her? Divorce her? Send her away? It might be for the best. Maybe Prochenko's stupid selfishness and her stupid self-abnegation might have combined to locate a way forward that was better for both of them. Nothing tied him to this country, except for an as yet unrealized duty to Miranda Popescu. A sharp intake of breath. A curious sucking sound. "Sergeant, come. Give me a handkerchief. He must have jumped over the wall." Prochenko laid his face against the cold metal buttocks of Nicola Ceausescu. He was listening to every sound. He was trying to make an image of the scene he couldn't see. Had she been on her knees before her husband, her lavender coat open and her throat exposed? Was Colonel Boku able to appreciate the line of raised bumps where the demon had bitten her? Or was that what was impossible to forgive? Prochenko could feel the tickling along his own imprisoned arm, the creature scratching him, burrowing under his shirt. Of course it had followed them here. The pain, when it came, would cause him to cry out, give himself away. Always before, when he had grabbed at it, the demon had eluded him. It had been buffeted upward by the wind from his hand. Delicate and gossamer, it would drift upward to the ceiling. But here it was controlled in a small space.
and he jabbed with his spread fingers, using all his animal quickness.
Yes, success.
He had it by something, its little arm or its little leg, and he tightened his grip, pulled it into his hand, and crushed it. He felt the breaking of its bones and its wet blood. When the time came for him to extricate himself, he found his shirt was caught. He had to leave it behind. His boot was jammed between two columns, and his foot pulled easily away. He crept out into the morning. The sun was breaking through the clouds. Elena was still there where they had left her. Doubtless they were searching the adjoining streets for a man without a coat or hat, but they would return before the gates opened. Doubtless Boku was speeding north in his automobile, leaving his wife behind, collapsed on the step of the baroness's mausoleum, her face immobile in a last little gasp of astonishment. There was a patch of blood over her breast, as if her heart had broken. And as the lieutenant prowled near her, touched his nose to the rim of her whorled ear, even slid out his long tongue to lick her cheek, he imagined a different source for her astonishment. It was not every day you saw a man become an animal under the bright, sweet morning sun. Back and forth next to her cooling body, while he felt himself grow hotter and hotter. He raised his mouth, his muzzle to the sky, and if at that moment what he felt was not exactly suffering, still he reassured himself that someone would suffer for what had happened here, what he had done, and it would not be he, but someone else. 4. Miranda Popescu. This is what Peter's letter said. Dear Miranda, it's been dry weather for more than a week, which gives us something to be grateful for. Not much action either, just a routine to fill up the day, you know, like high school. Do you remember when Mr. Donati gave you detention for missing an assignment? I'm sure it was very unfair. Anyway, it was the first time we'd been in a classroom together since grade school, and I was very excited. You were so angry. You sat in the front row working away, not looking up from your French homework. I wish I knew then what I know now. I would have aced French for sure, though knowing me, you never know. Anyway, you just sat there looking impatient. And you have this habit. You pull some of your hair back and hook it behind your ears so it won't fall in your face. I just sat there in the back row looking stupid, I am sure. I had to read this stupid animal adventure book called Grey Wolf, and I refused. I was reading good stuff with my mother after school. Do you remember the food in the cafeteria? Here we get bread and bacon and brandy before an attack. Not the same. I think about you often, and I don't just mean every day. I know I must have confidence in the good intentions of Madame Inès de Rougemont. Even though Lieutenant Prochenko knew a love letter when he saw one, but he was familiar with the background and the references, which gave him an advantage. For Colonel Victor Boku, the translated text was as perplexing as the original. He suspected a code, and he was intrigued by the name Miranda. It was obvious whom this letter was for. Miranda P. was on the envelope. On the evening following his wife's death, riding through the streets of Bucharest in the back of his limousine, Boku perused the letter once again. It was not his first priority to hunt down refugees from the previous regime. Miranda Popescu. Everyone knew this name. She had been the Baroness's prisoner, caught up in some failed intrigue. No, but it was more than that. It had been a political conspiracy, after all. It had involved the scattered followers of General Schenk von Schenk. Old women, mostly. How stupid Elena had been. Boku could have overlooked adultery and treason, he suggested to himself. But his wife's stupidity had been a constant irritant and could not be forgiven. Her lover was quite obviously a spy. No, worse than that, a stupid, inept spy. Here were his passport and identity paper, efficient forgeries. Here was his ration card, Sasha Andromedes, his name purported to be. Here was his photograph, an effeminate face. Boku had seen him before, he thought,
in a hotel restaurant. In the back seat of the Duesenberg, he studied these documents one at a time. He squinted over them, held them up to the window so he could see them illuminated in the fitful streetlights. Not just his coat. The fellow had left his trousers and his boots and shirt behind. But no one had seen him in the streets around the cemetery in the middle of the morning. What the devil? Boku sat back, put his feet up on the plush banquette. No, he was too trusting. He must not be distracted. This was a puzzle, a box he must unlock, not just for his own pride. Miranda Popescu was the key to it, perhaps. He must ask her what it meant. And, as it happened, he knew where to find her. A beautiful young woman, he had heard. Or maybe not. A man could dream. He pulled the unlit cigar from between his teeth and smiled. Oh, he thought, but when he found Sasha Andromedes, or whatever his name was. He went over some possibilities in a joking sort of way, and at the end of it he found himself in need of relaxation. Already he had had a busy day, a busy evening, a busy night. There had been meetings with ministers and generals and members of the assembly, and after dinner he had gone to see his mistress, a pouting girl even younger than his dead wife. As he lay in her arms, he wondered what he should do with her now, whether she'd expect something different. By the time he returned to the palace from her hotel, he'd already decided to dispose of her. The Duesenberg turned into the Mycenaean gate. The chauffeur opened up the door. Victor Boku smiled, nodded to the saluting guards, and hurried up the steps into the enormous building. He took the elevator to his apartment, from which he'd already had Elena's clothes, jewelry, soaps, and perfumes, and all other traces of her removed. He was a sociable man. Friends from the army visited at midnight, and he sat up smoking cigars and drinking brandy. After they had gone, he put on his jacket, retied his cravat. He picked up 2 clean glasses from the sideboard, 2 bottles of champagne, which he held by their crossed necks in his right hand. Exiting his apartment, he took the elevator down below the level of the street. He'd decided he had an interest in Miranda Popescu, not entirely for her own sake. She had been the Baroness Ceausescu's obsession, and the Baroness was dead. But she was, after all, the only heiress to a defunct imperial dynasty that still commanded, he supposed, a nostalgic loyalty. He could make use of that. Any loyalty, of any kind, was tenuous among his political followers. Besides that, he had his own needs. Urgently, more every hour, he found he needed the location of Sasha Andromedes. He couldn't get the fellow's long-jawed face out of his mind. When Boku found him, he would make him beg for death. The doors opened in a brick-lined corridor. There were guards among the flickering lanterns. Smiling, he ignored these men and their importunate saluting, their attempts at conversation. He passed the desk where a game of cards had been abandoned. But at the end of the corridor he stopped. "Please unlock this," he said to the fellow there. A square glass window had been set into the door. A lantern glimmered on the other side. There was always supposed to be a light. And as the man fumbled with the lock, he continued, "Do you find you have fewer keys in your pocket than a year ago?" "Sir, there was a time I had many keys. Recently. Now I have none. So I have an idea. The fewer keys you have, the more these doors stand open of their own accord." The guard had several keys. He was searching for the right one. "Up to a point," continued Colonel Boku. "When I was young, no doors were open, and I had no keys. So you could say my success consists of first accumulating them, then giving them away. But you must be approaching the maximum. When I see you again, I hope you have fewer than you have now." "Sir, I hope so." It was hard to get a smile out of these jailers. A little joke went a long way in these places, which were depressing as a matter of course. "I have good news for this particular prisoner," Boku said. Keys or not, maybe he should have sent a subordinate, one of the phalanx of efficient and dedicated fools he had accumulated recently. Or else one of his new friends.
They were all his friends. But it was impossible to trust them with a private matter.
"Thank you,"
he said, and the door stood open.
"Please take this bottle. It's too heavy. You may drink to the time when you have fewer keys."
What would it take to get the man to smile? There is a tendency, when a joke is unsuccessful, to repeat it again and again. Bottle in one hand, keys in the other, the fellow made an attempt at a salute, a funny gesture. Boku had no problem granting him a small guffaw. Then he turned his back. Once inside the door, he placed the remaining bottle of champagne onto the table beside the lamp. He laid down the 2 glasses, turned up the wheel. As the flame came up, he put his hands in his pocket. It was cold in here. But not, he saw as he looked around, otherwise uncomfortable. The prisoner was motionless in bed. He had blankets and a pillow. There were some books on the desk, and a notebook and 2 framed photographs. One showed a fat, middle-aged woman and her daughter, the prisoner's family. The other was a posed photograph from one of the Baroness Ceausescu's performances. She had signed her name, "To my old friend." The colonel smiled. Nicola Ceausescu wore a metal headdress and a halter made of leather straps that crossed between her breasts, leaving her arms and shoulders bare. Lesser artists might have used a body stocking, especially at 39 years old. Boku had no doubt he could have smelled the odor of her maturity from the second row. He and Elena had had tickets to see her last performance, the night of her suicide on the boards of the ambassadors. Who could have predicted he would never have another chance to see her naked backside? There was the smell of a used chamber pot somewhere in the room. Boku took a cigar from his inside pocket, clipped it, lit it at the flame.
"Domnul Luckacz,"
he said after a pause. He had the impression the man had been awake from the time the key had rattled in the door. Now he stirred, a bald man with a wasted, diminished face. Once, of course, he had been chief of the Metropolitan Police. That was during the German occupation, when the Baroness lived in the People's Palace.
"Come,"
said Colonel Boku. With the cigar between his teeth, he twisted off the cork from the bottle of champagne.
"I want to ask you a question."
He pulled out one of the chairs and sat astride it backward. He made a gesture toward the other chair, and Luckacz raised his head.
"Your Excellency, I must inform you. And also I protest. I am not given any clothes."
His voice was ugly, marred by a Hungarian accent. Boku laughed, then picked a shred of tobacco from between his teeth. He crossed his arms over the back of the chair.
"We don't stand on ceremony here. Do you have any complaints?" "Excellency, I am permitted nothing but underclothing." "But it's not as if you entertain. When it comes to me, I'm always having to choose a different shirt. And the cleaning bills."
He smoked his cigar. Then he couldn't resist.
"You must admit this is a convenience. No, I mean, do you have any complaints? You remember why you're here?"
"Yes, Your Excellency."
"It's because I asked you to do something. I gave you the responsibility."
"Yes."
"I asked you to arrest Madame Ceausescu, and I gave you the men to do it. I specified the hour, not some other hour, not some other day. You understand me?"
"Yes."
"Instead, you made your own decisions, with the result that Nicola Ceausescu was able to escape her crimes, destroy herself in a public theater in this city. You understand that was not a fortunate result?"
"Yes."
"Then allow me to let bygones be bygones. Have some champagne."
He threw his cigar into the corner of the room. Then he poured the frothing liquor into the crystal flutes, 2 of a set that had belonged to Nicola Ceausescu, as it happened, a gift from the German ambassador. With a glass in each hand, he went to sit on the metal bed, whose occupant had pulled himself upright. He sat cross-legged, huddled in his blankets.
"To your health. Now I want you to remember what you said to me that day. It was about Mademoiselle Popescu, Miranda Popescu, Fonchenk's daughter. Do you remember? The baroness sent you on an errand, is that so?
Yes, Your Excellency.
But you did not obey her. Domnul Luckacz, this is a custom with you. The baroness sent you to find this woman, this girl. She gave you an address, the name of a small town.
Luckacz groaned.
Now I must ask you. I was remembering General von Schenk. I was thinking about his daughter. There are very few photographs of the general, but I found one. Let me show it to you.
Boku drew a strip of photographic paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He angled it away from him so it would catch the lamplight. Von Schenk was posing with a group of officers, members of his staff. He had moved when the exposure was taken. His face was blurred and indistinct. The entire print was dark with age. The general had been dead for over 20 years. But the faces of the younger officers had all come clear. Obviously, they had been used to posing.
Do you recognize that man?
Asked Boku. He lifted the champagne to his lips but did not drink. While the policeman examined the photograph, he replaced the glass on the little table. Then he produced another document from his pocket, a folded ration card with a photograph attached.
"That is a person who calls himself Andromedes," said Radu Luckacz.
Boku cocked his head. Luckacz's voice, nasal and foreign, and therefore difficult to decipher, contained a trace of something. Was it rage? The strip of paper was trembling in his hands.
"It is not his actual name," he went on.
You astonish me. And is he an acquaintance of Mademoiselle Popescu? Is there a reason why he would be carrying a letter for her? You see, in this exposure, the name is printed down below. Lieutenant Alexei Prochenko, 9th Hussars. But you admit it is the same face on the ration card, the identical expression, clipped from another example of this same photograph. Don't you think so?
Luckacz shrugged. The paper trembled.
And if I were to look for this man, maybe I would look for Mademoiselle Popescu first. That would be logical. And maybe I would ask the help of someone who had no complaints, someone who was eager to show he could be trusted, especially if this was a private, secret matter, a personal matter. You have a fat wife and daughter in the city, don't you? Maybe you haven't seen them in several months, but they're still living at the same address. They are not permitted to go elsewhere.
Boku smiled. Radu Luckacz, his face skeletal, turned to look at him. What was he thinking? He was hard to read.
Mademoiselle Popescu is a dangerous criminal, said the colonel. Didn't I hear that somewhere? Didn't you tell me that?
Radu Luckacz's lips were thin and bloodless.
She killed a policeman in Brăila.
Yes. So will you drink your champagne? And will you help me, do you think? Will you help me bring her back to Bucharest, to stand trial or at least answer her questions? There are a number of people who are interested in her. A beautiful woman, I suppose. The last of the Brancovenus. At least I hope she is a beautiful woman. This is a duty you might owe to the Republic. And you must tell me if you remember this name. Inès de Rougemont. I believe she was a figure in society.
The policeman shrugged. His face was expressionless.
She has been dead more than 15 years.
Boku smiled.
Maybe not so long. And so we come full circle. Will you tell me where to find this little town?
Early that same morning, in Stănești Juai, Miranda was on the mountainside. The dogs ran back and forth below her as she retraced her steps toward the farmhouse. The Condessa de Rougemont had provided a refuge, not just for Miranda after she had escaped from the People's Palace, but for several others, Miranda's own mother, and even Jean-Baptiste, who had been the Baroness Ceausescu's steward. Miranda was grateful, but she did not think that Inés de Rougemont was motivated only by generosity. No, she was another woman like Miranda's aunt, a dabbler in the hidden world, and someone who had dreams for great Roumania. Miranda had seen her in a coven of strange women on Borgo Pass, a place that had been only partially a dream. If Miranda had not mentioned anything about that up to now, it was not because she hadn't thought about it. What could she say? I saw you in Dracula's castle in the mountains, where you were dividing up the future of the world. I rode there on a gypsy's back. Events that hadn't necessarily occurred in any normal sense. Surely Madame de Rougemont should be the first to mention that, explain it. Without an explanation, what was there to say? It was not enough to know she was a friend of Madame de Gratz, Peter's mother, and she lived in retirement in this mountain village, and she kept a number of connections from the old days. When Miranda came down through the meadow into the garden, there was a light in the cowshed and the dogs scampered away. Miranda came in the front door and walked down the stone-flagged corridor. The fire was lit in the big kitchen, where there would be café au lait and slabs of dry toast. Now that spring had come and she'd recovered from her illness, there were decisions to be made, explanations to be found. Perhaps Madame de Rougemont thought so too, because she was sitting at the oak table near the window. In the half-light she seemed dowdy, her gray hair struggling to free itself. As always, she had some powder on her cheeks, some artificial color. Of these women, she was the one who worked to maintain an artificial connection to her youth. She wore lipstick. She was dressed in a flowered gown and a lace shawl. She had been reading next to the window, and her eyes when she took off her spectacles were dark and bright. "You must not go out like that," she said. "I am pleased you're feeling better, but you must not go out by yourself." Miranda shrugged. "Madame Ceausescu kept me locked in my room." De Rougemont frowned. "I think we could chain you to the wall," she said. "You'd still be free." Was she referring to the tourmaline and Miranda's expeditions in the hidden world? She had poured a cup of coffee from the silver pot. Now she reached for the sugar bowl. "There is always part of this that is a game," she continued. "Let me remind you, men are dying in Bulgaria and the Ukraine. It is hard to imagine it when we are sitting here." Yes, it was hard to imagine. Miranda saw a furtive image of Peter's face as he had appeared to her in the brick gazebo in Cismigio Park. She shook her head. What was remarkable, she thought, was how much sugar the old woman used. She had not noticed in the overheated kitchen on Borgo Pass. But now she watched, fascinated, as de Rougemont poured milk into her big cup, then stirred in 5 teaspoons of sugar. In the meantime, of course, she was completely right. "That's not what I meant," Miranda said. "I know I have a great deal to be thankful for." This was not, however, what she felt, especially at that moment. She washed her hands in a basin of cold water with some yellow soap. The skin of her palms was chapped and raw. Madame de Rougemont stood up. "The others will be coming," she said. "I want to talk with you alone." Carrying her coffee cup, she led Miranda down a different corridor into another room, a library with glass-faced shelves, furnished in a more elegant and cosmopolitan style than the rest of the house. There was a carpet on the stone floor and a table set for two. She lit the petroleum lamp as Miranda came in, using a long wooden match that made her fingers, wrists, and forearms look unnaturally thin. Miranda imagined she could snap them between her hands. She imagined them catching fire in some terrible accident and burning down to stumps. But the Condessa had been nothing but kind from the beginning. What was the source of Miranda's anxiety and irritation? She knew Madame de Rougemont would want to talk to her about the tourmaline, about the hidden world, about her father. Didn't she also want to talk about these things? Didn't she want to trust this woman who had been so kind? Now the old lady moved from lamp to lamp.
and maybe she felt some of the same anxiety because she seemed so tired, dry, pallid, and brittle-boned. Her head was small and thin and bloodless, her lips red.
"We don't have much of a table here," she confessed, shaking out her little flame. "But there is wine."
It was from Georgia, yellower than water, sweating in a glass bucket of ice. Breakfast was already served, bread and butter, cold beet soup, and parsnip salad. It was too much to eat, too much of the wrong things. Miranda blew her nose on her handkerchief and then sat down. She was thankful at least that she could smell the soup. She felt a current of sadness in the still air, a sensation of loss that included many people, many things. She had come to this house with nothing, in borrowed clothes. How many times had she had to stop and start again?
"Come eat,"
said Madame de Rougemont, as she sat down across the table and poured a glass of wine for both of them. Who drank wine at breakfast?
"It will give you strength for your journey. Do you still feel like a prisoner?"
Miranda thought she'd always been too easy to read. Andromeda wasn't like that, or even Peter, as it turned out. "I'll tell you this," she said in English. "If you've got an idea I'm going to help you fight some personal battle or something, I'm not interested." De Rougemont smiled, a faint, wan expression. She answered in the same language.
"Why would you think something like that?"
It was because Miranda could not fail to be aware of the tiger's head bracelet on her wrist. Now it glinted in the lamplight next to the gray window. It made a noise as one gold bead moved against another. "Forgive me. Someone always wants something. Why else would you keep me here?"
"I was a friend of your father. Madame de Gratz and I were both friends of your father. That's why Peter de Gratz was on his staff."
No, don't say it, Miranda thought, but she did.
"You remind me of your father in some ways. But there is something else from your mother's side. You understand, your father was a modern man. He had his superstitions, of course, but even that was a substitute for something deeper. You must know I mean this in a technical sense. He had no interest in alchemy or conjuring. He was not like his sister, your Aunt Egypta. In many ways they were not close."
"I had a dream about my aunt," Miranda interrupted. She thought she would introduce the subject of what had happened in the castle on Borgo Pass, broach it indirectly. "Do you remember once you told me how she wrote that book about America as an experiment? An exercise in moral philosophy, or a utopia, something like that? Then it was an afterthought to put me into it, to protect me. 2 nights ago, she told me that returning when I did. None of that was what she wanted. I was supposed to leave home, go to college, marry, have kids, die of old age, I don't know. The whole thing was supposed to be more gradual. I was supposed to be older, an adult, which is why she hadn't given any thought to the consequences, or to what might happen to me or Peter or Andromeda." She stopped. It was a relief to talk about all that. But what the woman had remarked about her aunt and her father was beginning to penetrate. They were not close. How could they not have been close, or at least on the same side? But Miranda was still in the middle of what she wanted to say, and so, after a moment, she continued. "I know you want me to be like him, my father, a hero. General Schenk von Schenk, someone to grab hold of this world and force it to make sense. I know that's what my Aunt Egypta wanted, your old pal. She gave me all kinds of letters and directions and clues and gifts, and you know what? I failed at all of it. Things I tried on my own, things she told me to do. For some strange reason, this felt good to say, although she didn't quite believe it. It was a relief just to be talking in the English language. Madame de Rougemont interrupted with a faint, soft laugh.
"Perhaps it takes a hero to fail so much," she said. Besides, I don't think that you give yourself so much credit. An enemy of great Romania is dead because of you. And for a moment there was a truce in this terrible war. She was talking about things from the hidden world. Actions Miranda had taken, choices Miranda had made. How had she known about all that? No, but it was important to remember she had her own secret access to these things. Miranda reached out to touch her wineglass, and then paused. "Grab hold of this world," de Rougemont said. "Force it to make sense." Isn't that what Nicola Ceausescu was attempting? She got to her feet, drifted a little way across the carpet. "Mademoiselle, I think there are a few things that you ought to know. I knew your father intimately, but I was not a friend to your aunt." A bead of moisture slipped down the side of glass where Miranda had touched it. Yuck, she thought, if she was right about what this lady was implying. Then she let go of her reaction suddenly, hungry for what might come next. "Mademoiselle Popescu, do you sometimes wonder why your father wanted that name for you? The most common name in all Romania. It was not your mother's idea. Your father was a Republican, according to the German model that he learned when he was young. Do you know what that means?" "I guess. It means he was not so interested in someone who would force things to make sense. He was interested in dull projects, land redistribution, taxation reform, the abolition of hereditary titles. Not so much the glory of great Romania, or, God help us, the restoration of the Brancovenu family. That was your aunt's design. That's why she killed him. No, these are things we cannot know for sure." Miranda said nothing. As if just from touching the outside of the wineglass, she felt a little drunk. Inés de Rougemont moved back and forth across the carpet, rubbing her long hands as if they itched. Then she examined her painted nails. "That is why she took him from me," she amended. "Drugged his wine and brushed off. I don't know, when we were secretly engaged. Made him marry your mother. I can't prove any of that. These are more hard things to verify. It doesn't matter. I have had 25 years to say them to myself. But she wanted the pure Brancovenu blood. The day after his wedding, he came to me. But I know what you want to know. Your father was arrested on a charge of treason. He was said to be plotting a separate negotiation with the German-speaking regions of Transylvania. That was a lie, I know it. But the documents were real enough. Baron Ceausescu believed in their authenticity, at least at first. You understand, I knew him too. He was your father's oldest friend, comrade in arms. This broke his heart." Miranda had heard parts of this story from Captain Raevski, Blind Rodica, and Gregor Spla. Her father had died in prison after Ceausescu turned on him. "Where do you think those letters came from?" said Inés de Rougemont. "Who wrote them and forged your father's signature? Who abandoned your mother in Ratisbon hours after she gave birth to you? She could have brought her out. She wanted you all to herself. A weapon, I suppose. A hero, as you say, for great Romania." These words, these revelations were delivered without any force as Madame de Rougemont moved around the room. Because it's all so old, Miranda thought. Who cares anymore? Clara Brancovenu was asleep upstairs. "Who stole your mother from you, and your father, and your childhood?" continued de Rougemont, as if she were discussing something not so very important. Tears dripped down the outside of Miranda's glass under her finger. "I cannot prove these things, but they are true," said the woman. Her glass, close to Miranda's, had lipstick smears. So it is not a terrible thing to fail or disappoint such a one. Great leaders, as we see, bring great wars. Maybe all this was possible to listen to, Miranda thought, because it complimented something inside of her, a suspicion from long ago. At any rate, true or not, nothing was completely true. That's one thing she had learned. Baron Ceausescu might have had his heart broken, but he was still a bad man, from everything she'd heard. Egyptus Shank might have done all these things, but she had loved Miranda too. Or at least she had valued her and wanted to protect her. Tried and failed. What did love mean anyway? "So, what gifts?" said Inés de Rougemont. She sat down again, put her sharp elbows onto the table. There was something clownish and hectic about the circle of blush on her cheek. When Miranda didn't respond, she continued. "You said your aunt gave you clues and gifts. I see the bracelet of Queen Miranda Brancovenau. What else?" "Well, there's my father's gun. Jean-Baptiste brought it from the palace. I told you—" "Yes," de Rougemont sighed. "It would have been better if it had not fallen into Nicola Ceausescu's hands. 2 of the secret chambers are already empty. And in the normal way, this was what she used to murder her own son, the Gratz told me." So this lady had seen Peter, Miranda thought. Where? At Chismigiu Park? What had he said? Had they spoken about her? Though Inés de Rougemont lived here in hiding under an assumed name, she had often gone away on secret errands. Throughout the winter she was often gone for weeks at a time. Had she seen Peter and said nothing? What did it mean exactly? That the Condessa and Miranda's father had been intimate? De Rougemont smiled, and it was as if she'd read Miranda's mind. "Madame Magda de Gratz," she amended, "who heard it from her son the Chevalier, whom I myself have never met. You do not trust me. Let me show you what I mean." She fumbled underneath the embroidered placemat and drew out something she must have hidden there just for this purpose, a photographic print. It showed a young woman dressed for a costume ball. Beside her was a man in military uniform, Miranda's father, she supposed. His face was indistinct because he had shifted during the exposure. The Condessa stroked the edge of the photograph with her brittle finger. Her face took on a hungry, rapt expression, and everything that was sharp or dry or ugly in it nevertheless found its exact counterpart in the young woman's beautiful features. "Then there were some smaller things I lost, money I spent," Miranda said, to change the subject. "I gave money to my friend Andromeda. Nothing's left." De Rougemont shook her head. She covered the photograph with her white palm. "But that is not quite true. There is a reason why we are here. I was waiting for your health to improve." Miranda said nothing. She was of 2 minds. Madame de Rougemont had plucked her out of danger, given her a home, probably saved her and her mother's life. An old friend of her father's. Why did she feel so defensive and begrudging? It was obvious what they were talking about. "It's an object, but you can't touch it or hold it," she admitted finally. "I've got it hidden." "But this is quite a riddle. Where?" Miranda didn't want to tell her. She thought in half an hour this woman had taken valuable things from her and given her nothing except beet soup and parsnips and some wine, none of which she'd tasted. "In my mind," she said, which seemed safe and ambiguous, and at the same time she was reaching down into the crevice in the rocks where she had kept the tourmaline. "I don't even know if it's real," she said. And for a moment she was digging around in the wet moss, heart in her mouth because it was gone. But no, there it was in a different place. And when she touched it, held the pulsing, soft-skinned jewel in her hand, then something new shuddered to life inside of her. Madame de Rougemont squinted across the table.
Miranda could tell she knew something about what was going on. She was no fool.
"What do you see?" she said.
Miranda stood on the hillside, the tourmaline clasped in her hand. In the hidden world, her sinuses were not congested, and she took deep draughts of the cold air. But of course she was also in the farmhouse library among the glass-fronted shelves. She sat in an old wooden chair with a cane seat. The mountains rose above her, and the sun was bright and harsh on her cheeks. She thought she could climb up the chute of rocks behind her, away and out of sight. It wasn't possible. The door to the library opened, and her mother stood there.
"Miranda, comme j'étais inquiète? How worried I was. Are you all right?"
She came into the room and stood in the middle of the carpet. Her hair was tidy, curled up under tortoise-shell combs. She spoke in French, which was enough in itself to break the mood.
"You left without waking me," she said. "How are you feeling? Would you like an aspirin? This is not proper food for you."
Ever since Felix Ceausescu's death, Miranda's mother wouldn't let her alone.
"I'll ask Jean-Baptiste to bring hot broth and chamomile tea." "What are you talking about? I can tell that I'm intruding."
Miranda dropped the tourmaline into the moss. She was relieved and grateful to see no trace of impatience on Inés de Rougemont's arch and brittle face. Her hand was on the photograph beside her plate, and now she slid her napkin over it, and everything about her seemed to soften as she spoke.
"Clara, come in. Of course, how silly of me. I thought we might need this breakfast for an expedition, but I was premature. Some chamomile tea. It would be lovely."
"What do you mean? Miranda is in no state to go outdoors." Clara Brancovenu stood rubbing her hands together, her face full of anxiety. "Why don't you tell me anything? Please, I want to know." Ever since Felix Ceausescu had died in her arms, bled to death on the stones outside the People's Palace, she had been intolerable. Miranda often found herself consumed with irritation, which made de Rougemont's gentleness even more impressive, she thought grudgingly. There was nothing in her voice but tenderness and concern. This for a woman, if Miranda had understood, who had married her lover, stolen him away.
"We were talking about Nicola Ceausescu," said Inés de Rougemont.
"Oh, and doubtless you were telling terrible things. You have no kindness for her, but I have told you many times how she saved us, freed us, me and Madame de Gratz, when we were in prison. It was an act of kindness, and a day later she was dead. Don't tell me that was a coincidence. But in this house all I hear is terrible accusations of murder and worse, things that no one can know for sure." She was not capable of understanding even this, Miranda thought, that Nicola Ceausescu had murdered her own son. Now she stood in the middle of the room, rubbing her hands. Inés de Rougemont waited for her to stop speaking.
"Clara, you're right," she said. "How could I disagree? It is not prudent to curse the dead."
5. An unexpected visitor. It is not wise or prudent to curse the dead, because the dead can hear us. Often they don't care. Many are able to lay down their grudges with their abandoned bodies. Many are able to forget their struggles and animosities. Nicola Ceausescu was not one of these. People say the ghosts of suicides are especially dissatisfied, especially unquiet. Some of the thousands who had visited her catafalque in the nave of Cleopatra's temple had reached past the velvet ropes to touch it and say a prayer, or had followed her coffin through the streets to Bellu Cemetery, took a peculiar pleasure in imagining her among the restless dead. They saw her roaming the dark stages and concert halls in Bucharest or abroad, where she had seen so many triumphs. They saw her stalking the galleries of the People's Palace, or else lighting candles in the upper windows of her old house on Saltpeter Street. For years she had filled the little theaters of their hearts and heads. How could they think of her as vanished, gone? They might have been thrilled to imagine the truth. The Baroness's coffin had not contained her body, but only a small quantity of ectoplasmic slime, but they would have misinterpreted the cause. Nicola Ceausescu had not killed herself. She had not cut her own throat, as all the newspapers had reported, on the boards of the ambassadors. She had not cheated the police as they reached out to arrest her for collaboration with the Germans and other more sinister and private crimes. The struggle between her self-love and self-hatred, always the secret of her artistic success, was too violent and elemental to have been resolved that way. No, it had been a cold simulacrum that had collapsed on stage, animated from a distance. Nicola Ceausescu had died in the People's Palace, torn to pieces by a monster that was only partly human. She retained the burning rage of the murdered dead. Only 2 living persons were exempt from this. One of them was her loyal steward, Jean-Baptiste, who had found her despoiled body, wept over her, gathered her up, washed away the blood. The following afternoon, he was fussing in the kitchen. Just as Radu Luckacz boarded the train to Pitești and Râmnicu, Jean-Baptiste came in through the double doors carrying toast and marmalade, some of which was on his sleeve. Since the untasted breakfast of parsnips and white wine, the library had become Miranda's favorite room in the house. As Jean-Baptiste hovered above her, eager to speak, she put down her book. "You don't have to bring me coffee and these things. You don't get paid for it, and it makes me uncomfortable."
"Miss, I do what pleases me. That's how you know I'm not your servant."
"Did Nicola Ceausescu pay you?"
"No. Sometimes I had to give her money in the old days."
He stood above her, still dressed in the baroness's personal livery, which he had worn the whole time Miranda was imprisoned in the People's Palace. Then she had thought his disheveled appearance in the ornate rooms had suggested some kind of ironic statement or attitude. Now she was less positive. His shirt had come untucked along one side. His jacket, decorated with threadbare scarlet piping, was too small, and pulled his narrow shoulders into a perpetual shrug. He was an old man with a high, bald forehead. He had shaved that morning for the first time in days, and had cut himself in several places. His Adam's apple showed a shiny new scab. He dropped the plate onto the table and then stood above her as she nibbled at the toast. She thought it was the least she could do.
"What are you reading?"
asked Jean-Baptiste. "It's a history book."
"My mistress used to read poetry in the morning. She was a brilliant artist. There was no one like her."
"So you say." Unexplored between them was the memory of Miranda's last night in the palace, when the baroness had forced her to read the palindromes in Isaac Newton's Black Book, and had fired her father's great revolver in the dark, releasing 2 powerful demons into the world. That night the baroness might have killed Jean-Baptiste, shot him, or else had him shot.
"She had an artist's temper," he continued lamely, picking at his nails.
After the baroness's death, he had come up from the city with the gun and the book, too. So it must have been somewhat on his mind, Miranda thought. Maybe the way he stood above her and praised the baroness now, under the circumstances, that might have been part of the same ironic impulse. He and Miranda's mother never missed an opportunity to praise her. Stubbornly denying her worst crimes, they gave her the benefit of every doubt, though they lived in a house of people who had suffered from her malice. "Yeah, that's great," Miranda said in English.
"Artists and geniuses are different from other people. Ordinary rules don't apply to them, because they give us so much pleasure."
"I'll keep that in mind," she murmured. The book she had been reading was about an earlier war, Miranda Brancovenu's struggle against the Turks. This was Miranda's namesake, the first of the White Tigers, and the first person to wear the bracelet that now clattered wearily against her cider glass. And at least in this narration, it seemed as if she'd had an easier time. Whatever her tribulations, the victory had always seemed inevitable. And the forces of evil, the forces of good, all that was clear. But maybe that was the thing about history. The pattern of events, of causes and effects, only was obvious when you looked backward. Nothing that happened had any predictive value. No doubt that White Tiger also had been struggling in the dark. Miranda closed the book, sipped the cider, nibbled the burned toast. Everything was murky now. Again, Romania fought the Turks, this time along an enormous battlefront south of the Danube River. But the Turks had mobilized against their wishes, according to some reports. They had been dragged into a war because of a secret treaty with the German Republic. When the Germans had occupied Bucharest, there had been no reason for this war. And for a while there had even been a truce between Romania and Russia. Miranda had had a hand in that, as Inés de Rougemont had acknowledged. But in almost her last official act, the Baroness Ceausescu had broken the truce in a spectacular double cross, and peace had slipped away. Now the Germans still occupied the Bukovina and the Transylvanian oil fields, and there was a bloody stalemate along two gigantic fronts. The worst of everything had come to pass. Needless to say, the first White Tyger had had her own setbacks. From time to time, Miranda had read in her book, she had found places of refuge in the middle of some disaster. Once she had spent a winter here in these same mountains, prior to some new indomitable push. And in those places of refuge, did she talk and think and argue about what should be done? Or was everything obvious and plain? Over the winter, during her illness, sitting up in bed to read Madame de Rougemont's books, Miranda could not fail to wonder what she was going to do next, after she was well. First things first, as Stanley, her adoptive father, might have said.
She could be a model to us because of her passion. You must understand that.
Jean-Baptiste was still talking about Nicola Ceausescu. He stood beside the breakfast table with a teapot in his hands. His voice was anxious and aggressive because he did not quite believe what he was saying, Miranda thought. If he believed it, why was it necessary to say it over and over? But a woman he loved was dead. That much was true. And maybe she really could still be a model to us because of her passion. Maybe he was right about that. Miranda sighed, glanced out of the window at the long dun fields. She had slipped out of the world into this village, but now it was time. Spring would be here soon, and she could walk into the mountain without coughing or losing breath. Even her cold had cleared up. For a week it had made her dull.
You must seize hold of what you want, said Jean-Baptiste.
When she had first come to this world from Berkshire County, Miranda had pretended that she had a choice. She had believed, or had attempted to believe, she did not need to be concerned with all these problems, these people she didn't know, mothers and fathers she'd never met, intrigue that did not concern her. And when that turned out not to be true, she had thought that she could learn to dominate the world of guns and horses and heroes, because she was a princess of great Roumania, and the daughter of General Schenk von Schenk. When that led to disaster, she had retreated here, where what remained was access to the hidden world.
Courage, that's what there is, said Jean-Baptiste. That's what she showed me.
What was he talking about? But it was true that Miranda had not used her strength, especially not here in this refuge. She had kept it secret, and she had not shared it with the Contessa de Rougemont, who had saved her and protected her mother, too, a woman she had every reason to despise. Miranda had not thanked her. She had not given what she so obviously wanted. The previous evening, the Contessa had left the house after supper, as she sometimes did. So when she next returned from wherever she was, from her own secret world, Miranda thought, maybe there was something to be done. And it was not just because Miranda owed her something for her kindness. But maybe she could help Miranda to discover the strength of the White Tyger, accomplish the task she had been brought here to perform. Which was... what? Oh, the usual. Peace, stability, justice, and the American way. Though maybe those things would not turn out to mean what her aunt had intended. Peace, above all. Maybe her father's friend could be trusted, as she had never even tried to trust her own mother or Egypt de Schenk. And as if conjured by her doubts, Princess Clara now appeared at the library door. "I thought I smelled some coffee. My, doesn't that look good," she said. But even in the middle of these banalities, her eyes were nervous, sad. "Miranda, how are you feeling? You look flushed," she said.
Do you have room for us? We don't want to interrupt." Damaged by suffering and her long imprisonment, as always, she seemed close to tears. Behind her came Madame de Gratz, up from Bucharest for a short visit. She had arrived that morning. Her shoulders were hunched, her back was bent from osteoporosis. Her eyes were milky with cataracts. She walked with a small limp, one hip higher than the other. But even so, she moved with purpose and deliberation. A small woman with white hair and a thick neck. Physically frail, she gave an impression of mental energy that was different from the princess. Eschewing small talk, she marched into the room and sat at the long table. She unrolled the newspaper, the Romania Libera, which had come up from the capital on the first train. She pressed the pages flat, and then peered carefully at the headlines out of the sides of her eyes. It was her morning habit. She would not allow anyone to read to her. Except for her adoptive grandmother in Colorado, Miranda had not spent much of her time around old ladies. But these three, four if you counted the ghost of her aunt, she had gotten to know well, their little similarities and differences. All of them were joined to her and to each other by her absent father, General Schenk von Schenk, the lover, the wife, the sister, the political patron and confidant. Old vines hanging from a tree, and even when the tree was cut down they managed some vestige of its absent shape, their static struggle.
"Here is the news from Staro Selo,"
came Magda de Gratz's quavering voice. Miranda listened for a while. She knew that she and Madame de Gratz were interested in the same piece of information, but they weren't likely to find it in the newspaper. If what the paper said was true, the war was almost over, almost won, the road almost open to Byzantium itself. But there had been a victory. A great assault had been beaten off. Miranda glanced down at her book again, then closed it and sat for a while with her mother while Jean-Baptiste bustled around. Rude to the rest of them, he always treated Peter's mother with a dignified courtesy. The contrast made Miranda smile. In time she made excuses, said she would go lie down. But she didn't feel like it. She didn't need to lie in bed worrying about Peter Gross. It was a bright day outside, and she wanted to take a walk, prepare herself for Madame de Rougemont's return. Her lungs were clear today, and she felt strong enough to climb up into the hidden world, up the chute in the rocks that she discovered, where the air was thin. She went out the big wooden door. The dogs came to her, and she set off along the edge of the field toward the evergreens in back of the house. It was a bright, windy day. Clouds scurried over the mountain peaks, still capped in snow. The air was colder than she'd thought, but Miranda didn't want to go back for more clothes. Instead, she hugged her arms and put her head down, kicking at the mud with her black boots. She found herself hurrying, stumbling away from the house as if she chased the dogs. In retrospect, later, she imagined she might have known where she was going, or else, below the level of conscious thought, she had received some clue. The crows screamed and scattered across the field. Lucius and Lionel were investigating something at the edge of the trees. When they shied back, panicked and whimpering, she broke into a run. She found Andromeda curled around herself in a nest of last year's pine needles. Her hindquarters were streaked with blood, and she was licking at herself with her long tongue. There were clumps of coarse hair in the hollow in the bank. Her face seemed bruised and malformed, and her eyes started open, gray with patches of blue and darker blue. Heart-struck, Miranda watched for a sign of recognition. The voice, when it came, was queer and airless, pushed out of shape by the distorted mouth.
"Go away. Fuck you. Leave me alone."
Then,
"Can't a girl get some privacy?"
Miranda, who had already turned her back, stood hugging her shoulders as if to keep herself intact and untransformed. She raised her sleeve to wipe her face, wipe her eyes before she turned around. "Hey."
"Hey."
Her friend lay curled up in the little hollow, her naked bottom streaked with red. Now, despite her words, she untucked her arms and legs and stretched out languorously, making no effort to hide herself.
Her mouth opened, and her tongue lolled out. She licked her shining teeth. Her whole body seemed to shine. Her hands and feet were filthy and abraded, black with grime. "You don't look so good," Andromeda said. She yawned again, stretched her arms out straight. "I don't feel so good." "What's for lunch?" "Coffee? Toast?" "Yuck." But then she smiled, got to her feet. "Sounds good. I had a rabbit yesterday." "Hey, stop that. You look all freaked out." Miranda smiled. Then she turned to watch her mother stumbling across the field, fashionably attired in a fur-lined overcoat and carrying a rolled-up bundle of tweed, Miranda's coat. "This is great," she murmured. Already she had imagined smuggling Andromeda indoors up to her room. Already she'd been reminded forcibly of stuff they'd done when they were younger. Once, Andromeda had gotten so drunk at a party she had almost passed out, and Miranda had had to drag her, giggling and laughing, upstairs in the house on Syndicate Road at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then, as now, maybe it was appropriate that mothers should get involved, and that they should bring unlooked-for understanding. Andromeda's mother, after all, had known what it was like to have too much to drink. "What happened to you?" said Princess Clara. "How could you come out without your coat? What's the matter with the dogs? They were barking to come in, and then they hid under the table. Oh!" "Mother," Miranda said, "you remember Lieutenant Prochenko?" "Ma'am?" Andromeda stood up straight, arms at her sides. Miranda could see the deep, long scratches on her belly and her legs. A flicker of anxiety crossed the princess's face, but then she closed her eyes and opened them. "Yes, of course. How do you do? Lieutenant, it's been a long time." She kept her eyes fixed on Andromeda's face and head, and then she reached out her gloved hand. In her other arm she held the bundle of cloth. "I brought this for my daughter, but you might have a greater necessity. Madame la Princesse." Andromeda took the silk-lined tweed and swung it around her shoulders. Princess Clara grunted with relief. "I have not had the opportunity to thank you, Lieutenant," she said, "for your loyalty to my daughter and the protection you gave her all those years when I was a prisoner in Ratisbon. A mother could not wish for more devotion over so much time." She spoke carefully and slowly. Andromeda bowed her beautiful yellow head. Her hair was longer than Miranda had ever seen it. "I had a duty to your husband, ma'am." "As did we all, but we were not all able to fulfill that duty. As for my daughter, you see how she's grown up. I could not be more proud and grateful." So it was with her mother's help that Miranda brought Andromeda upstairs to her own room, bundled up, her face hidden, the dogs whining and whimpering on their beds under the grand piano. Miranda brought wet towels for her to clean herself, clean the blood out of her private parts. "Can you give me a little space here for Pete's sake?" Then she coaxed her into bed and went downstairs to make sandwiches out of bread and meat. When she returned with a plate on a tray, as well as a cup of hard cider from the barrel, she was surprised and touched to see her mother had entered the room when she was gone. The princess was sitting on a stool beside the bed, talking in French about old times. When Miranda approached from the other side, Andromeda turned her head on the pillow and rolled her eyes, an expression so familiar and yet so far away and gone it almost hurt. Miranda smiled and hoped the princess hadn't seen. A minute later, she stood up to take her leave. "Oh, Miranda said when the door closed. Andromeda licked her lips. "Do I have a tale to tell?" she said. Also an expression from the long-ago time in Berkshire County where they'd been girls together. Then, half gleeful, half condescending, she would use it to introduce the story of some romantic escapade. Boys had always been crazy about her, and not just high school kids, but college boys, and even men older than that on one memorable occasion. Then she had burst suddenly and uncharacteristically into tears, as she did now, led to them maybe by the same chain of reminiscence.
Oh, it's okay, Miranda had said, then as now in her upstairs room, dragging her half out of bed to embrace her, and she'd been right. But now she didn't think she was. The tray that she had balanced on the coverlet fell to the floor, the cider spilled. Miranda could see the cuts under her hands, under the soft yellow hair bleeding on the sheets. The tears dried up. Andromeda pushed her away. Kneeling on her heels beside the bed, Miranda waited for her to start talking. But she didn't, and so Miranda changed the subject, rearranged the tray, picked up the cup. "Give me that," Andromeda said, and she reached down to seize the piece of beef from the plate. Scorning the bread, she brought the meat to her mouth, ripped into it. "Something I don't understand," Miranda said, standing now, looking out the window at the mountain and the windy afternoon. "It was a dog at first, a yellow dog. Some kind of Labrador mix. Now that's changed." "Sure. Haven't we all grown up a little bit?" "But you're hurt." Andromeda laughed, a sound and an expression unconnected to any kind of levity or joy. "Wolves, you know," she said. "They scratch at each other and they bleed all over the place. They do it when they, you know." "What?" "When they, you know. What are you talking about?" Then she told Miranda about something else. A creature who had bitten her. A little demon on the wind, its wings as fine as spiderweb. It was the demon from the big revolver. It had bitten her along her arm and neck, and she hadn't been able to get her hand on it. But in some kind of enclosed space, she had managed to pinch it between her fingers, crush it. "There was a lot of blood," she said. "I wiped my hands on my leg. I couldn't get it off. It had a perfume, or it made me bleed, you know, like an animal. Estrus, you know. I'd stop whenever there was a stream or a puddle all the way here. I'd try to wash away the stink, which brought them howling, all the way out of the city or else through those woods. You used to tease me back at school. This was worse than that. Whatever." "Oh, A." Miranda turned from the window, took a few steps toward her friend. But there was nothing in Andromeda's face that suggested she would welcome or accept any type of comfort or contact. She'd pulled back her thin lips to show her teeth. Miranda had seen the little demon tumbling into the air off the barrel of her father's gun, a tiny figure of a naked boy. She'd said the words that had released it, while the Baroness Ceausescu pulled the trigger. There was another demon, too, a toad with a flap of skin under its fat arms so it could fly or glide. Abscess, it was called. Where had it found its home? What section of muddy trench? Had it followed Peter Gross to Staro Selo? She had thought obscurely she had helped release these dangers into the world, some kind of love, some kind of violence. But she had not imagined they would follow her friends, chase them down. Abashed and guilty, she went to stand next to the window again. She watched the clouds blow over the mountain peaks. When she turned around, she saw Andromeda had gone to sleep as suddenly as an animal. It was probably the best thing. Before she left, Miranda pulled down the sheets to examine the long scratches where scabs were already forming. She wondered if her mother had seen any of this, seen what was before her, when they had all stood together under the trees. 6. Luckacz makes an arrest. Radu Luckacz changed trains at Rumnicu, to the narrow-gauge railway that led into the hills. One of the palace secretaries had telegraphed ahead, and the men were waiting for him on the platform. They were dressed in the pale uniforms of Boku's Resistenta party, as Luckacz was himself, baggy and drab, without any specific indication of rank, save for the discreet party badge on his lapel. Rumnicu was on the border of the Tara Romaniasa, the heart of Great Romania. It was still in Boku's country, within his circle of control. The National Assembly, dominated by his political party, still had some influence here, though that would weaken as they moved into the mountains. The Carpathians in Transylvania belonged to General Antonescu and the army,
except where the Germans had reoccupied the country north and east. Hostility between the colonel and the general had lessened over time, smothered in the war effort and their mutual need, but it still burned dark and smoky in these border towns. The party cadres and off-duty policemen, recruited from the capital, moved uneasily along the station platform. A young officer of the Brankovinu artillery had accompanied Luckacz from Bucharest, a narrow-chested braggart, like most of Boku's private militia. Yet even he seemed to droop under the cold scrutiny of ordinary soldiers in their black and green uniforms, waiting for their trains. Luckacz had his hands in his pockets. Then he took off his hat and wiped his bald head with his handkerchief as he stood under the signal board. He cast his mind forward to what he was going to do and why. It was not a question of personal revenge, he told himself, nor was it an issue of Boku's private, secret affairs, as he'd confided in the People's Palace, a personal favor for the President of the Republic. Nor was it primarily a matter of Luckacz's own safety and ambition, or the safety of his wife and daughter, who were under Boku's hand. There was no possibility that Luckacz ever could regain a semblance of his old rank. No, nothing like that. Still, it was good to be free in the open air. It was a matter of principle. There was a nest of traitors in Stănești-Giuai, aristocrats, republicans, and conjurers who could not be tolerated under present exigencies. The Baroness Ceausescu had given him the address, sent him on an errand, but he had failed her. Burdened with anger and jealousy, he had disobeyed her and been punished for it. He would not make that mistake again. But he would redeem himself by carrying out her last commands. If Andromedes was there, he would turn him over to Boku's men. It was no concern of his. Anger and jealousy had made him lose his way. No, he was after Miranda Popescu, the traitor's daughter, the alchemist's niece, who had killed a policeman, and the conspirators who had hidden her, refugees from the anti-conjuring laws and the collapse of von Schenk's political intrigues. These were the people he would bring back to Bucharest. He would act in the interest of his suffering country, as the Baroness Ceausescu would have wanted, and from heaven she would look down on him and forgive him for abandoning her, abandoning what he loved. Boku had been right to seal him in that dungeon, which was not, after all, as bad as he'd deserved. Boku had been right to give him time to purge himself, consider his mistakes. And Luckacz would take the golden bracelet of the Brankovinus from Miranda Popescu's wrist, and he would buy a little coffer from a jeweler, a miniature strong-box in golden filigree. He would take the bracelet to Nicola Ceausescu's tomb. He would lay down his offering among the flowers and candles, the simple keepsakes from all the people she had touched. And if Boku took Sasha Andromedes, or Alexei Prochenko, or whatever his name was, and disemboweled him, or tore his body into pieces, or set him up before a firing squad in the Piazza Victoriae, Luckacz would make no effort to attend the ceremony. He would be with his wife and daughter. He would have better things to do. Now, finally, the whistle blew. The little train steamed in. In Stănești-Giuai, Andromeda was out of bed. Miranda had found clothes for her among the grooms. She stood in Miranda's room looking out the window, full of bravado that was about an inch thick. She wouldn't show her nose outside, but she would pace the floor or sit on the settee, wincing at every sound on the stairs. And she seemed to want to talk girl talk, like the old days, as if they were still kids together in high school, or in Miranda's room in Stanley and Rachel's house, as if nothing had happened since. It seemed stupid to Miranda, stupid and poignant at the same time. She knew why it was necessary. It disgusted her to find herself drawn in, especially when they talked about Peter Gross. A certain you-know-who, Andromeda called him. I had a letter from him. I had it in my coat pocket, but I lost it after I came back from Tutrakan. You know, Staro Selo. Did you see him? Yes. He sent you this letter that he kept over his heart. It was really sweet. But I lost it in my clothes. I'm sorry. Was he safe? How did he seem? What did he say? What was he like? Miranda thought. and then aloud, because she knew she wouldn't get a satisfactory answer to these questions, "What did the letter say?" "I didn't read it. Besides, what do you care? Didn't he break up with you that night in the park? Chismigiu Park? Or did I get that wrong? There was nothing to break up." In these conversations, Miranda felt about as genuine as an actress on stage, rehearsing dialogue that could not express or uncover what she wanted to say. But if words and intonations failed her, still her emotions were real enough. Andromeda was jealous, she supposed, jealous and sad. Her beautiful eyes glanced nervously around the room. But then she gripped her hand and said in another voice entirely, "I'm not telling you the truth. There's more of Peter Gross in him than my old friend. You'll like him better now. We all have changed. How could we not have changed?" After that, she turned away and would not speak, even when Miranda coaxed her. She answered in monosyllables that faltered entirely, while Miranda made up her mind. Steps must be taken. Full of a new determination to confide in Inés de Rougemont, she went downstairs. Since their first conversation in the farmhouse library, Miranda had learned a good deal more about her hostess's life, from Madame de Gratz and, circumspectly, from her mother, and from her own inferences and from the Condessa herself, 4 separate pieces of information which overlapped. Before her love affair with Miranda's father, Inés de Rougemont had lived a life that had not satisfied her. Daughter of a banker, married to a Spanish diplomat, she had been a popular and fashionable hostess among the embassies and drawing rooms of the old regime. All that had ended with her surrender to Frederick Schenk von Schenk, who had introduced her to Republican politics and, through his sister, to conjuring and alchemy. But the general married Clara Brankovinu, then died in prison on a fabricated charge. When Egyptus Schenk was first arrested and the conjurers rounded up, Madame de Rougemont found it impossible to return to any version of her former life. She manufactured her own death from a disfiguring disease. Then she retired to her secret farmhouse in the mountains, shortly after her obituary was printed in the Roumanian and foreign press. Miranda had verified all this. She also understood that the Condessa retained, even after 15 years of isolation and the start of an enormous war, a web of duties and connections that often took her from the house. Some of her forays, Miranda guessed, must involve trips to the dream landscape where they first met, meetings with Zuzana Knaus and Mrs. Chatterjee and Olga Karpov, efforts to reform the world. Never, since Miranda had been in the house, had either of them spoken of that first meeting, in a place that, after all, did not exist. Out of some reticence or delicacy she didn't understand, Miranda had not spoken of it. But now Andromeda's arrival seemed to indicate a change in the weather and the time. The wounds and damage she'd sustained, the anxiety she'd brought with her from Staro Selo, now presaged a new urgency, a need for Miranda to puzzle her way forward once again. The safety she had found here was quite obviously an illusion, a bubble in the stream. In any case, she had no right to safety, because of the suffering of her friends. That suffering had made a trail that led her to the misery of her own country, and to her place in it. She had failed to safeguard her father's pistol. One terrifying night in the People's Palace, Nicola Ceausescu had used it to release 2 secret messages into the world, communications of love and war. All through the winter, the Turkish and Roumanian authorities had predicted imminent victory, imminent peace, though they disagreed which side was closer to surrender. Now, after more than 6 months, the war had collapsed into a kind of stalemate, the worst outcome of all, as Miranda had learned from Mr. Oates in 9th grade history. So something must be done, if Miranda could manage it, some intervention in the hidden world. So, a change, and maybe the Condessa also sensed a change, for she was waiting for Miranda by the long table in the library. The black book and enormous revolver, which Jean-Baptiste had brought up from the city, were laid out on the slab of oak. Miranda scarcely glanced at them, because of her failure and the guilt she felt. In time, Madame de Rougemont got up and locked the door. She lit the lamps. It was evening time. Miranda sat in the tall chair, and they played a game that wasn't a game. They shared what they knew. Miranda said, "I didn't want to speak to you about these things because they sounded stupid and because I didn't trust you. But now I know that trust is something I cannot afford. Why should I trust you when you ask me to doubt the motives of my aunt? Everything I know, it doesn't matter. I believe we're searching for the same things."
Wise girl. And that is?
"A cessation to the current hostilities," Miranda said, using a phrase from the Romania Libera.
All of them? Not just in Staro Selo.
"All of them." And in just a few more minutes they were ready to begin. "Before," Miranda said, "I meant I didn't know what I was doing. There was no, I don't know, volition like a dream. I just did the things I did. Later I could see I was in the world again. Things happened because of it. You know about this. A German general and a minister were dead. And that traitor Dysart and Dr. Theodore, and the elector of Ratisbon. It's hard to feel responsible for them." The tabletop was supported on two massive pedestals. There was no cloth on it, but the china and the glassware were delicate and fine. "I did things with no choice," Miranda said, "maybe because of my Aunt Egypta. Now it's different. I'm in both places at the same time, and I'm awake in both places, wanting things, deciding things." Madame de Rougemont walked to and fro beside the long table. Light, brittle-boned, she seemed to float from one side of the room to the other.
Because of Kepler's eye.
"Yes."
Describe it.
Miranda frowned. "They call it a jewel, but it's not like a jewel. It gives a little bit between my fingers. At night-time there's a glow. I feel there's juice in it, or blood."
"And it is in your hand?"
"Yes, now." There was nothing in Miranda's hand. It lay empty, palm up, on the wooden arm of the chair. But on the hillside, as she'd said, there was the tourmaline clasped in her fingers, and it seemed to throb as she climbed up. "I've left the swamp behind," she said. "It's way below. This is another place. It's beautiful. Spring flowers. I don't know their names." Yellow and lavender in the tall grass, she climbed up through a valley between two peaks, which she'd seen from far away. Sometimes she heard a trickle of water, or crossed a little stream. There were more rocks, and then the grass was shorter, coarser, growing in uneven tussocks as the way grew steep.
Is there a path?
"No path. No one has been here for a long time." She said this, but up ahead there was a pile of little rocks. Once, maybe they had formed a cairn. The land had closed in, and she was in a sort of a chute about 20 yards wide. She was in the right place, she knew. One rock wall was in shadow, and one gleamed in the morning sun. And it occurred to her even then that there might be some things she wanted to hold back and not describe. At first there was a simple reason. In the comfortable library, the curtains had been drawn to push away the darkness, which still seeped in around the edges. Sitting there, how was it possible to communicate in words the place where she was standing in the sun? Purple flowers in a crevice in the rocks. Should she describe them? The stony peaks looming overhead, the ice mountains beyond them? And as she turned around to catch her breath, should she describe the valley she had left behind? The air was dark and thick down there. Creatures strove and struggled with the mud around their knees. Which part of this landscape was important? Which words would she use to make it real?
"How do you understand which way to climb?" asked Inés de Rougemont.
"I'm just going where I want." She listened to the Comtesse's exasperated sniff.
"This is a journey that has been described. Who do you think has left those piles of stones? No. You must follow the path he made, although it has been a long time. But when you find the place, Then you will know."
Miranda didn't like to hear any of that. Every word the Condessa had spoken, Miranda sensed a change in her, a little more desire in her voice, a little more greediness in this gray-haired woman, her father's friend. Greed for knowledge, she hoped. De Rougemont didn't understand how difficult this was. Miranda wasn't even touching the tourmaline anymore. She'd slipped it into the pocket of her shirt, because more and more she had to use her hands in the steep chute, and the rocks were insecurely piled. She had to work even to breathe. Now every step brought her higher into a landscape where the air was thin and sharp and painful in her lungs, which had not recovered from her sickness. She knew that now. Part of her wanted to stop, and it wasn't because the way was difficult, but the Condessa wanted something, that was clear. Probably she hadn't told Miranda everything. Probably she also had held something back. Miranda climbed the chute. There was always something greedy about this, she thought, this search for knowledge and secret power. No wonder her descriptions were sparse and stingy. Was she doing Inés de Rougemont a favor, offering her payment for room and board? Hand over hand in the thin air, the rocks had closed in around her, and there was nothing to see. But even so, there was another part of her that wanted to keep moving, to discover something of her own. Here she was, though, trudging in the footsteps of some half-mad, long-dead philosopher. She was sure of the way now, even though she hadn't seen a mark or a cairn in a long time. In the valley behind her, there were hundreds of thousands of things. There was the long trough of the war from Kula to the sea. The little ape and the scarlet beetle struggled in the mud down there. All that she left behind. But maybe now she could look forward to a new terrain, purified of everything that had grown over and obscured the four essential elements of rock, water, light, and air. The chute she was in began to level out, reveal a larger chunk of sky. The hummocks of grass came back, the little flowers, but every few steps, when she stopped with her lungs burning, she needed fewer words and a smaller vocabulary to describe it. Even so, she found herself dissembling by holding back what she knew she could make clear. Who was this woman anyway? "I'm at the top of the chute," she said begrudgingly, looking back. She turned around. And, oh!
"What?"
"Oh!"
"Tell me."
Inés de Rougemont, in her powder and rouge, in her old-fashioned yellow dress, paced back and forth along the library carpet. "There's a building up ahead." Maybe she shouldn't say anything at all, Miranda thought, sitting in her chair in the dark room. Up ahead there was a little tarn, its surface smooth and polished as a mirror. It lay at the bottom of a bowl of rocks, and on the far side the peak jutted up. Below it a snowfield fell into the lake, and the flat boulders made a kind of promontory. It led to a stone tower which rose out of the lake. It was not high nor especially well made, Miranda saw when she came close. A path led through the scree, although in places it had slid into the lake. Miranda picked her way through the unsteady slope until she stood on firmer ground, and she could see part of the rock wall had collapsed.
"What is it?"
said Inés de Rougemont. Miranda caught the sound of her impatience as her little bloodless gray head peered into the dark corners of the farmhouse library. The tower arch had fallen in, and the coping stones from the high wall. There was an inscription cut in the uneven surface of the rock. I, Kepler, Fecit.
"Please tell me,"
whispered Inés de Rougemont. The tower seemed abandoned, but Miranda wondered whether there was something left alive, a brooding presence she could almost feel. She was not afraid, maybe because part of her was sitting in the safe black farmhouse far below. But it was possible the entire structure was waiting for this moment to collapse. She climbed in through the ruined stones and past a rusted iron doorway let into the rock. There was a stair to the top of the tower, and maybe she should stop here, but she couldn't help herself. She was not immune to curiosity, which is another form of greediness. She had a sudden sense she didn't belong here, but still she labored up the stone steps.
and when she stood on the stone platform above the lake, she could see many things. Above her, the sun was blocked by the ice peak. Miranda could see stars in the sky. No, not stars, but planets. Stanley had shown her the difference. 3 or 4 were visible in the milky morning light. She had the tourmaline clasped in her hand. From a new vantage point at the lip of the platform, she could see far down the valley. She could see into the darker, thicker air. But there was no unusual detail. Maybe she needed some kind of telescope, a tool.
"Tell me what you see."
And she reported dutifully, begrudging every word. She did no justice to the immense cracked landscape, the splintered rock, the walls of ice. None of that was what de Rougemont wanted to hear. She was interested in patterns. She didn't care about the smell of the cold air. "There's some kind of chamber underneath me, locked like I told you. Maybe that—"
"No. It is where you are now. He described it in his letters. It is where he made his observations."
"Well, I'm not sure."
"No, it must be there, where you are standing. He described the place."
Leaning over the parapet, doubtful, skeptical, the tourmaline throbbing in her hand, she turned her back to the valley and looked up. The tarn lay in a bowl surrounded by ice peaks and rock walls. No trail led away from it. If Johannes Kepler had climbed past this place, Miranda couldn't see where he had gone. Maybe, she imagined, she would find a new path among the rocks, and she wouldn't even be able to turn back and see the valley anymore. Part of her wanted to leave the stone platform and go onward, in spite of her foreboding. What had her aunt said about her home in Berkshire County? That town, those streets, those people. You might search for it and find it in the hidden world. But that was not the path of obligation, or the way to comfort Peter or Andromeda. To find that place, or even to search for it, was not a desire she would confess to Inés de Rougemont. No, she was in the here and now, looking toward the future. She looked up into the rock peaks. But even so, she wanted to be silent. The words she had used to describe this place had diminished it somehow, stripped it of its beauty. She shivered, hugged her arms, drew the tourmaline up to her face, and then she saw what the Condessa wanted. It was in the little lake. When she peered over the broken edge of the parapet and down into the water, she realized she was looking at a map. In the perfect light, she could see under the water's surface. She could see all the boulders, rocks, and stones that formed the bottom of the lake. And not only was there no distortion, but everything, all of it, seemed unnaturally clear and focused, as if the layer of water functioned as a lens. After a long silence, she described it to Inés de Rougemont, or else she half-described it. "It's like a map of Europe and the world. Then the boulders climb out of the water, and they form the boundaries in North America, Southern Africa, and Japan, I guess. That's the banana-shaped sand beach. So from there it slopes down like the bottom of a bowl. Lowest in the middle is Bucharest and Great Roumania. Those blue pebbles are the sapphire domes of the old city."
"Where the time is deepest,"
murmured Inés de Rougemont. Peter had told Miranda about the sinkhole in the Egyptian desert, and she could see the line of it, reaching from the Nile to the Hudson. Maybe it was a piece of grass in the water, because there were living things deep in the lake, and things that floated on its surface, and currents and ripples and reflections, also of clouds and overhanging cliffs. From the lip of the tower, Miranda watched the surface move as if alive. That was what was so hard to describe. And at the same time she was conscious of some other living presence in the stones below her feet, as if she almost heard some grunting, whispering voice. "It's like, oh,
"What do you see?"
Miranda had the tourmaline in her hand, which sometimes appeared as a stone to her, and sometimes as a plum or a grape or something edible and full of juice. But maybe that was because she could not bear to imagine the truth. She was holding something that had come out of the brain of Johannes Kepler, the alchemist, who had made this place for his own purpose. Carefully, deliberately, she laid the jewel down on the parapet. And then she found herself sitting in the wooden armchair in the darkened farmhouse library, her hands open and grasping. Inés de Rougemont walked back and forth, her face as fierce and eager as a hawk or an eagle or a bird of prey, set to seize up every little word in her painted nails, devour every little phrase in her lipsticked mouth. Miranda couldn't stand it. Groping, blind, she put her hand out for the tourmaline again. It yielded under her fingers. And there she stood on the stone tower, with the planets above her, clustered together in the apex of the sky. The light was muted, the sun behind a cloud. Miranda looked down and saw a breath of air turn up the surface of the water north and east of Bucharest. She described it because she understood what she was seeing. The great curve of the Russian advance, which had severed the German supply line south of Minsk. But it had stalled now, stopped, and there were circular eddies where the armies had divided and sunk down in the mud. Inés de Rougemont paused between the table and the armchair. Her eyes were staring, blind, yet she strained to see.
"Tell me,"
she said. And Miranda told her about the 7 small fish that issued now out of an underwater crevice. Russian dreadnoughts in the Black Sea. And then a line of enormous turtles on the dry land farther south. They were near the river in the middle of the line.
"You have discovered it,"
said Inés de Rougemont. "What?"
"People said Johannes Kepler could predict the future."
"Tell me all of it.
"Follow the borders of Great Romania."
Miranda found the mountain ranges and the Wallachian plain. There's a tree trunk that's fallen to the bottom with all its broken branches. It's the Danube. And I can see the battlefront with Turkey south of Kieselet. Kieselet was where Peter and Andromeda had had their accident. Both of them separately had told her about that. The town was marked with a whirlpool and dirty bubbles on the surface of the water. But on the south shore of the river, she could see the places where the water was churned up by the columns of horses and armored vehicles, she guessed, near Staro Selo and the Tutrakan Bridge. That's where the turtles were. In the library, Inés de Rougemont pulled from a low shelf a dusty atlas. She opened it, spread the book across Miranda's lap.
"Mark what you see."
Head splitting, Miranda tried to think it out. First things first, step by step. The Condessa gave her a lump of graphite, which turned her fingers silver. She felt danger all around her, and it wasn't because of the Turks. But in the hidden world, there was a cloudburst out of the cloudless sky, and the map disappeared into the lake, covered over by the stippled surface of the water.
"Do not stop."
"I can't see anything," Miranda said. She dropped the graphite to the carpet.
"Please, this is important. This might be a new method to break through. Some new machine, a strategy to cross the river. There is a rumor that the Abyssinians have abandoned their neutrality. This is information for Antonescu if we can reach him."
On the parapet, Miranda stared down into the map of Europe. The rain had stopped as soon as it had begun. Because of its secret alliance with Germany, Turkey had mobilized and then attacked. This was after Nicola Ceausescu had let the Russian cavalry penetrate the German lines behind the Fedorivka salient. And though an unofficial truce still held between the German and Roumanian republics, elsewhere all of Europe had been drawn into the war, every country led by its alliances.
"So you must."
Miranda didn't want to hear it. She'd lived in her aunt's book, studied the world wars in the 9th grade. If she'd learned anything from Mr. Oates, it was that these advances and assaults and counteroffensives meant nothing at all, or else nothing but slaughter. Victory was not to be found that way, not a victory that meant anything or did not lead to other wars. No doubt Egypta Shank had manufactured Mr. Oates to teach her this, make this point exactly, so that here upon this parapet she would not be tempted to assume, "Don't you see?" she said. "We can't win that way. It's an illusion."
"Yes, but we can lose."
Miranda considered the justice of this. If the Turks crossed the river in any kind of numbers, either by the open water or else by the bridge,
with the bulk of the Roumanian army trapped on the south shore. That was Peter's sector by the Tutrakhan Bridge. But even if he weren't in danger, she would not decide between these competing claims, not now. The power was in her hands, and she would not use it to please one person or someone else. Instead, she looked down at the map in the bottom of the pool, at the map over her knees, and forced them to coincide. She closed her eyes, sealing them together, and then she pulled herself away. She left the roof of the broken tower. The rain was a relief, but if she got soaked, she'd freeze. She looked for shelter underneath the stairway by the iron door. "What do you see?" "I don't see anything." But then she told the Condessa about the door, which was locked with a heavy bolt of iron. On the lintel above her head, she saw some pictures scratched into the stone. "But I think there's something in here. It's like a prison door. There's something alive in here. I can feel it." "Stop." These symbols scratched into the lintel. She remembered them from Edith Hamilton's mythology. The mirror, and then a strange little round face. Once, for about a week and a half, Andromeda had been interested in astrology. In the darkened library, Miranda asked for a glass of water. Then she said, "Do you remember that lady? That French lady on Borgo Pass? She said a German alchemist had tricked some kind of spirit or a god." "Stop." There was something in Madame de Rougemont's voice, some hint of menace, but also a strange wistfulness. She stood in the shadow behind the chair, and Miranda couldn't see her face. But there was no possibility at all that she would bring her something to drink. So Miranda, parched and with an aching head, labored to stand up out of her chair. As she turned, she could sense some kind of movement. The door stood ominous and silent and solid in its stone frame. She had her hand on the bolt, but there was movement in the rubble of the broken wall. This tower won't last forever, Miranda thought. Expedite the inevitable. She saw the movement of a small creature that hesitated when she turned to face it. Then it was gone. The bolt ended in a ring. She tugged on it for a moment, banged it with the heel of her palm. Maybe something was suffering in there. How could she leave that big door closed behind her? She hammered at the bolt. It would not budge. "Oh, stop," said Inés de Rougemont. "Tell me what's in here." Something shifted in the rock wall, and Miranda left the door to look out through the fallen gap, not toward the lake, but toward a field of rocks and tumbled scree under the shadow of the mountain. Something was alive out there, or else not quite alive. She glanced back at the door, and when she turned again, she could see a man climbing toward her over the unsteady stones. When she watched him, he stood still, but if she closed her eyes or went back to the door or fumbled with the water pitcher on the table in the library, she knew he'd take a few steps toward her, as if playing some ectoplasmic game of red light, green light. He was a ghost, she knew. The rain had gone away. The rocks were dry. He stumbled toward her, and she recognized him. He was dressed in expensive clothes, a little man with a ruined face, whom she'd last seen on the banks of the Husik River. He was the Elector of Ratisbon, Miranda knew, her old enemy. He had kept her mother prisoner inside his house. And maybe all she'd have to do is flap her hands and he'd disperse, undone by a current of air. She went and tugged on the iron bolt a little more, but it was rusted shut. She was too weak. And as if conjured by that thought, she understood now she was vulnerable, and the nature of the danger had changed. It wasn't just the man in the cutaway suit, but there were little animals all around her in the crevices in the rocks. Above her the sky was going dark, though it was still mid-morning. "You've been lying to me," she said. She was thinking about the photograph on the library table. Inés de Rougemont, young and beautiful, dressed à la paysanne. In her mind, the soldier with the blurred face had been replaced by the Elector of Ratisbon, and she knew why. The last day she had spent in America, she had seen this apparition. This little man in his formal suit, his face ravaged with smallpox. And at the same time, Peter had seen this woman, dressed in gypsy clothes, and he had recognized her and known her name. Told Miranda later when they'd spoken of that crazy day, the first time she had seen him in the People's Palace, when the doctors had cut off his hand. How could she have been too stupid to remember her name? Radu Luckacz noticed the change in the weather as he walked up from the village along the dirt road. In the main square of Staro Selo, looking up into the night sky, he had seen the stars, moonlight on snow peaks. The darkness was dry and fresh. But then in a moment the sky had clouded over and a mist had come, a thickness of the air. It clung to the torches Boku's lieutenant had insisted on lighting. Looking back along the road, Luckacz saw each flame surrounded by a dull glowing sphere. And he was immediately dispirited because he recognized the effect of some unfair conjuring. It didn't matter. More men had joined them in the village in addition to the 20 who'd been with him on the train. Boku had insisted on this show of force. He was unsure of the extent of his power, Luckacz assumed, and whether the local police would obey him. There were just a few peasants in the house itself, peasants and servants and women, and maybe Sasha Andromedes. Everything else was superstition and stupidity. So this was where the Comtesse de Rougemont had found refuge all these years. It had been 15 years at least since the newspapers had reported her death. This was a simple matter, and in the past it would have been unworthy of his personal attention. He paused to catch his breath. The torchlight shone on ditches full of wild flowers on both sides of the road. He rubbed his bald head and then replaced his hat. At the same time, he stifled one of the gasping sobs that came over him from time to time as he remembered standing on the threshold of the amber gallery. The baroness had turned away from him, her hands over her breasts. She had asked him to come here to this mountain village, and he had disobeyed her. Now she was dead. The road, a long dirt and gravel cul-de-sac, curved up to the farmhouse among the long-needled pines. There was dirt on his boots, the cuffs of his trousers. It looked now it might rain. Kneading the stones, stretching her back, Miranda crouched down in the broken wall. Furry, blind underground creatures moved among the rocks. Badgers, rats, weasels, moles. She went up on her hind legs against the door and hooked her hand through the iron ring. This would do it, she thought. For the love of God, said Inés de Rougemont. It was a strange phrase under the circumstances. I'm sick of this, Miranda said, standing by her chair in the farmhouse library. All of you with your secret plans. What's the difference between you except what side you're on? There really was a difference, and Miranda knew it. She persevered for the sake of the larger point, as Stanley might have said. Don't you want to try something else? All of you, all of your struggling for wisdom and what's good. Where are we now? A world war? I know all about it. I read about it in my history class. Olga Karpov, she betrayed us. But there'll always be someone like that, some part of you. That's what I mean. You have to ask yourself, what are you afraid of? Miranda asked herself aloud to quiet her own fears. Surely there was something in this little prison in the mountain pass, something sealed up by Johannes Kepler centuries before. And the world could be one way, or else it could be another way. The door was too heavy for her hand, but the paws of the White Tyger could pull it from its frame. Because she knew she had the strength, she stopped. Certainty comes from weakness, Stanley had once said. Now there were clouds over the sun, and a wind had come up out of nothing. The rain had blown away. Miranda felt a change of pressure in her ears. There was lightning, a momentary tree of light above her head, an explosion of thunder. She looked up to see a yellow hawk with its claws outstretched. There was a bald old crow among the rocks, and the hawk stooped down. But then it was caught up by the wind and overturned against the shuddering wall. The ghost of Theodor von Geiss und Ratisbon had disappeared. But there were little animals among the rocks, small, weak mammals that were the tiger's natural prey. They cringed and hid in the cracks and crevices, afraid of her smell, she imagined.
except for the bald crow that hopped down the slope. She followed it. But by the side of the small tarn, she stopped, turned around in time to see a bolt of lightning strike the ruined platform where Johannes Kepler had once stood. Maybe some other force was trying to free the creature in the dark cell, or else destroy the tower. The air was full of ozone. Miranda turned downhill. Boku's young lieutenant had a sickly face, unpleasant in the torchlight. There was a hedge that separated the road from the fields, and the building loomed up suddenly in the dark mist. A single lantern burned on the ground floor, a diffuse flickering light because the curtains in that room were drawn. "Someone is awake," murmured the lieutenant. Luckacz had disliked him more every step they took. His teeth were stained and ragged when he smiled, as now. All the way from Bucharest, Luckacz had assumed these men were under his own control. Now suddenly, he didn't think so. He had no official rank or position after all. Why were all these men necessary for a simple investigation, a simple arrest? On the train, and again in the village station, he had made his plan, which was to knock on the door with these fellows in reserve, to take away the possibility of resistance. But now he understood the lieutenant had a different plan. "What do you think?" whispered the lieutenant. "We will set the barns on fire. Then we'll have the light to shoot." The man beside him unstrapped his rifle, a new bolt-action carbine from North Africa. Was he joking? Appalled, Luckacz raised his hand. "I will secure the house. Please wait," he said. But then there was a stroke of lightning and a crack of thunder above their heads, as if the weather were as disgusted as he was by these young men in their uniforms without insignia. Were they soldiers or hired criminals? Another flash of lightning, and the air stank and tingled. Some of the men threw down their torches. Oh, they were a fine, superstitious bunch, not one of them fit for army service or the Metropolitan Police. And the rain came in a sudden burst. The lieutenant pulled the men into the trees on the other side of the road. The torches flickered, wan and wet. Afraid of a little rain, Luckacz thought, and he pulled the brim of his hat over his eyes, strode to the door, pounded on it, tried the bar. It wasn't even locked. He'd show Boku's thugs what one man could do. One old man in the rain with nothing but a spring-loaded pistol in his pocket. He wouldn't even use it. No plan was necessary. A house full of women, and maybe a few fellows to help with the cows. No doubt they lived in a different structure. But as he pushed open the door, a third bolt of lightning struck the house itself, the chimney or the ridgepole. Miranda gave the tourmaline a squeeze, then descended to the farm outside the mountain village of Staro, which had been caught in the same storm. She imagined she would fall into her body with relief, but at first she couldn't tell the difference. Thunder broke above her head. She came to herself in the darkened room. Her chair had toppled over. There was broken glass under her hand. Someone whimpered in the dark. Maybe the house had been struck by lightning. If so, maybe it wasn't such a big deal. Nothing seemed to be on fire. The room was still intact. Miranda listened to the rain against the windows, and as her eyes cleared, she saw the table had been overthrown. She remembered struggling to her feet, striving forward against all odds to find a glass of water. Had she done all this? She was surprised she'd had the strength to move such an enormous slab of wood. The door hung on its hinges, the lock broken, the jamb splintered. Had someone broken it down? Now it swung open, and the woman came in. Inès de Rougemont, carrying a glass lantern in her hand. Miranda remembered the diving hawk, remembered also the bald crow. Where was he? Maybe there. In the improved light, she saw a man wedged beneath the table, the back of his bald head against the floorboards. He had a nosebleed, and was bleeding also from a gash behind his ear. The Condessa limped around the room, opening the curtains and the shades. Light-headed, Miranda knelt down beside the injured man. She recognized him, she thought. She tried to push the table off him, but she was right. It was too heavy. She took a napkin from the floor and pressed it against the man's ear to stop the flow of blood. Once in America, a neighbor's kid had hit her with a rake in the same spot. The wound was superficial, Stanley had said, though it had bled and bled. Where had she seen this man before? She remembered when he started to speak, his voice harsh, nasal, foreign.
Miss Popescu, it is futile to resist. It is my duty to inform you that you are in a state of criminal apprehension because of your complicity in the murder of Felix Ceausescu on the 12th of Thermidor. I advise you to come quietly and not attempt to abscond, as you have been known to do.
This was Inspector Luckacz. She had seen him in Mogoshwaya when she and Peter had given in to the police. Luckacz had had thick gray hair then and a black mustache. What had happened to him? It was not so long ago. The rain crashed against the dark windows. Madame de Rougemont had put the lantern on a low table, turned up the flame in the glass chimney. Grimacing and limping, she came toward them.
"I'll send Anton for the carriage," she said.
"No," Miranda said. "I'm sick of this." She held the napkin against the man's bald head. "Why are you chasing me?" she asked as gently as she knew how, although her voice was trembling.
"Miss, I believe you must expect, because of your connections to the former royal family of this country, that our laws and natural laws do not apply to you. Even in this room here I see evidence of conjuring and prestidigitation. Though you might have used it to disarm me, and even if I give my life for it, still I must assure you that—"
He was interrupted by the Comtesse de Rougemont's contemptuous grunt.
"Let him alone. We must be gone from here, all of us, tonight. He won't have come alone." "No, ma'am. There is no possibility to resist. The village boys were frightened of the lightning strike, but the house is surrounded. I have 27 men, including several members of the Brankovinu artillery."
Inés de Rougemont paused at the doorway before going out.
"Come with me," she said.
But Miranda ignored her. Why should she pay attention to a woman who had lied to her, or at least had not revealed a connection to her enemy? She felt sequestered and sheltered by the rain around the house, as if the effect of the big world might be muted here. Everything had always happened so fast, but now the inspector lay helpless, stunned. He stirred feebly under her hands, simultaneously rejecting and accepting her ministrations. There was a pitcher of water intact on the sideboard. She held a glass of water for him to drink. Maybe he was lying about the 27 men. But if the house was surrounded, he was the man she had to convince. "You know I had nothing to do with this." Alone with Luckacz in the room, she wet another napkin. It was streaked with marmalade, so she found a clean corner to wipe under the policeman's nose. There was gray hair in his nostrils. "I've defended myself against men who wanted to kill me," she said. "Peter, too." The policeman flinched. The bump on his head was just beginning to rise.
"Miss Popescu,"
he said in his dry, irritating voice,
"you were with the Chevalier de Gratz when he fired on Felix Ceausescu, the child of our national heroine."
At least this was true. Miranda had dragged the boy from his bed, dragged him down into the courtyard where he'd died. His blood had spread over the cobblestones.
"The Chevalier de Gratz."
"You don't really think that?" she interrupted. "That woman murdered her own son. She shot him from the balcony."
"The Chevalier de Gratz."
"Are you insane? The boy was in my mother's arms." She pressed the napkin against Luccatz's bald head. The cloth was saturated with blood, whose flow had lessened now. He continued in a whisper, his voice harsh and strained.
"Miss Popescu, you must understand that you are not familiar with all types of firearms, as I am. And I must insist to you that in a circular space it is quite difficult to verify the source of this type of gunfire. There are echoes against the stone."
He was hopeless. He was like Captain Raevsky and Jean-Baptiste. What was it with these men? Besotted, she supposed, in love, a kind of love.
You must reassure yourself we will dispose also of the Chevalier de Gratz, continued Radu Luckacz. He will not escape us. No escape is possible. None of this will arrive as a surprise to you, or to your associate Andromedes, who—"
He grimaced, choked, could not continue. "Who?" Miranda asked.
"But you know this man. You must not lie to me. God help me."
Now suddenly he seemed in pain. His back arched off the floor, then subsided. Miranda took her hands away from him. "I know the name. It's a little strange hearing you use it. I've known her since I was a child." Miranda said this almost without thinking, though maybe she had meant to calm him, because it was clear he considered Andromeda a menace of some kind. But now he was even more agitated, his eyes wild and round as he turned toward her. His scalp started to bleed again.
"What are you saying? Is it true?"
"Hush! Be quiet. Don't worry about—" He grabbed hold of her hand. She pulled away. There was no reason to talk to him anymore. Where were Inés de Rougemont and the others? She didn't want to be alone with this man anymore. "That's enough," she said. "It's useless." But it wasn't useless. During the time he'd spent locked up in the People's Palace, some of the details of the Baroness's last days had receded from him. Certain facts had been expunged, as if his guilt had wiped hers away. Now they all came back. All his suspicions. How could it have been true about Sasha Andromedes? "I have known her." What did it mean, this disgusting feminine pronoun? In the amber gallery, Sasha Andromedes had been writhing on the floor. Yet he had been able to see her small breasts under her clothes. And if that was true, then was it also possible that Nicola Ceausescu had murdered her own son and Kevin Markasev before him? Surely all of it was a disordered fantasy, invented to make Luccacz's betrayal seem less awful in the long, cold, naked nights inside his cell. Now he lay on his back in the conjurer's library, the table overturned. Miranda Popescu kneeling over him. This was what one old man could do. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Nothing had been right since Nicola Ceausescu died. Now, in the doorway, he could see a man he recognized, the Baroness's steward, Jean-Baptiste, still wearing his old jacket with the red lapels. What was he doing here?
"Inspector Luckacz," he said now as he came into the room.
"What is this?" he said, reaching down to grab hold of the Resistenta badge, a cheap enamel pin in the shape of an eagle's foot. He ripped it away from Luccacz's coat, tossed it across the room. Luckacz stared up at the steward's face as he bent over him, his astonished red-rimmed eyes. Was it possible this man had been his friend?
"There is nothing for you here," said Jean-Baptiste. "You must leave us alone."
He was holding on to Luccacz's arms, pulling him to his feet, when the window broke and one of the short-barreled carbine rifles pushed in through the glass, pushed through the curtain, fired. The shot was loud in the enclosed space, and now suddenly the room was full of people. The wind from the broken windows sucked at the lantern flame. The light, which had seemed sufficient for her and Inés de Rougemont, now could not separate the blundering, chaotic shapes. Miranda made no sense of it, and she was struggling to her feet when Jean-Baptiste collapsed. At first she didn't know what had happened, but he was hurt, and he pulled her down with him as he fell. She had her arms around his narrow shoulders, and his face was near her own. He hadn't shaved for a few days. His breath stank of anise or fennel, something like that. She closed her eyes, groped in the darkness for the tourmaline. When she touched it, she found she was sitting in the upland pasture among the rocks below Johannes Kepler's tower. And it wasn't raining, and the dark clouds hurried overhead. She sat in a cold patch of sunlight on that windy hill, and she had a hedgehog on her lap in her cupped hands, curled up tight around its wound. It never would uncurl. "No," she said. "No, no," because she just couldn't stand this. Not again. In the dark, crowded library, she helped the old man down, laid him on his back.
"You leave us alone,"
he said again. In the high place in the hills, Miranda saw the bald-headed crow close by her among the rocks, and a blind badger poking his nose out. And there were other creatures in the grass. She saw the ruined tower and the Elector of Ratisbon on the stone platform looking down. "You leave us!" The room was full of shouts and stamping feet. There was a smell of oil or kerosene, and the smoke stung her eyes, too. Some idiot had brought a torch into the room. A burning drop fell to the carpet and was extinguished by someone's wet boot. But in the new light, Miranda could see a soaked, bedraggled bunch of men in identical beige-brown suits, their carbines in their hands. A young man with a thin, greasy, pockmarked face was giving orders. The Comtesse de Rougemont wasn't there, nor Anton, nor the other men from the farm. Madame de Gratz wasn't there. But the men had caught Miranda's mother, dragged her out of bed. She was barefoot, dressed in her nightgown and nightcap. She had a man on either side of her. Their hands seemed huge on her elbows. She gave Miranda a timid smile as if to reassure her. And Miranda was reassured, because in another part of her mind she grasped hold of the tourmaline and felt the juice on her fingers. Soon she would get up and unsheathe her bright claws, rip these little men apart. The greasy lieutenant with the yellow skin and the bad teeth was standing in the middle of the room, a pistol in his hand. He was talking to Radu Luckacz. You're a disgrace. What made you think you had the stomach for this? This is men's work, not for babies, and I'll tell the chief about it. Why should we risk our necks for you?" But then he noticed Miranda, and he brought his gun around. "So," he said, "the last of the Brankovenus. I suppose it's time." Then he was interrupted by two more men coming in, and they brought Andromeda between them and pushed her down onto the floor. She was dressed in some of Miranda's clothes, a shirt and trousers. She scrambled away from the muzzles of the carbines, crawling on her butt toward Miranda on the hearth, where she was kneeling over Jean-Baptiste. The old man's eyes were closed. Andromeda seemed pretty calm under the circumstances. She yawned, let her tongue loll out. "This really sucks," she said. The greasy man stood above her with his pistol out. Rain still dripped from the brim of his hat. "Domnul Andromedes," he said, "this is very good. We'll take this one back for the chief." "I can't wait," murmured Andromeda. Miranda closed her eyes. Now is the moment, she thought. Her fingers were slick with the juice. She sat among the rocks on the high mountain. She would lay the little hedgehog down among the dry stones, and she would let the beast come out of her. She would do it now. In the secret world, the day had closed down, the mist come in. The valley and the peaks were hidden. The tower loomed out of the fog. Above her was the smell of ozone and the storm breaking. A rockfall in the pass sounded like gunfire. She flexed her fingers. "Mademoiselle," said the soldier in the pale uniform. In the farmhouse library, he stood above her with his pistol out. Clara Brankovenu heard a crack of thunder and the rain against the windows. "Yorgu, Mihai, get the men outside. Take this gutless fool," he said, gesturing toward Inspector Luckacz. Clara recognized him from her time in Bucharest. "And this one," the man continued, kicking Lieutenant Prochenko with his muddy boot. "Then come back." Someone pulled Prochenko to his feet, pulled him away. Miranda knelt by Jean-Baptiste in front of the dark fireplace. He lay on his back, and his eyes were closed. Blood was on his shirt, but not much. There wasn't a lot of blood. Clara watched the gun in the soldier's grip, watched it turn. She screamed, wrenched herself away from the big hands that held her by the elbows. She threw herself across the room, hiding Miranda's body with her own. The torch had gone out, or had been taken out, leaving a layer of oily smoke. The door was crowded with people as they tried to leave, to give the Resistenta man the room to fire. But he did not, and when Clara looked up again, she saw his face transformed.
All the cruelty and purpose in it was replaced with fear, and she watched also, horrified and amazed, as Jean-Baptiste stirred and stretched and tottered to his feet. When he opened his mouth, Clara knew what she was hearing. She could not but recognize his hoarse, soft, well-remembered voice, which all of them had heard in theaters, or at political gatherings, or on wax recordings, or in the first scratchy and indistinct radio broadcasts from Bucharest that summer.
"Oh, my friends, what have you done to me?"
Light came from a single lantern, flickering in the air from the broken window. The room seemed empty now, because the men in their pale suits had pushed themselves back against the walls or bookcases or glass-fronted cabinets, leaving the carpet open, a natural stage.
"And what have you done to this good man?"
said the voice out of Jean-Baptiste's clenched lips.
"Look at him. He was my friend, faithful and loyal to the end of the entire tragedy. Look at him now."
And Jean-Baptiste moved his hands down his dirty and disheveled shirt, stripped it away from his withered body. Clara had been wrong about the blood, but it had seeped into his trousers, and his back was wet with it, and now his hands as he displayed himself, the angry lips of his wound. He did a little dance across the floor, and students of Nicola Ceausescu might have recognized a motif from the first act of Raphael Hoffmann's Madame Faust, which she had performed to such acclaim in Petersburg in the old days.
"Faithful to the end," she said, "and this is how he is rewarded. This man who took me into the old baron's house when I was just a girl, and helped me and cared for me in the days when I had nothing. Even when I lived in the people's palace, he was the only one who never lied to me, who loved me for myself alone, my own self, not like some of the others here."
Two men had been pulling Radu Luckacz through the door, but now they left him, shrank away from him. Jean-Baptiste stepped lightly over the floor. He raised his bloody finger in a manner that was neither threatening nor accusatory. Instead, he moved his hand in front of Luckacz's face, a gesture that was delicate and soft, almost as if he meant to caress the old policeman, who stared at him round-eyed.
"You almost kept with me," she said. "You stumbled at the end, my old companion. But it heals my heart to see you, I promise. We played some tricks on the potato eaters, you and I. Ma'am, shush, be quiet. This is a special night. Do not ruin it by talking. I will come for you, never fear. You and I will have a reckoning, but not tonight. Before we make amends, first we must feel our separation. But as for you, Domno, what about you?"
Lieutenant Prochenko stood beside the door, hands in his pockets, the back of his head against the yellow plaster. He opened his mouth, displaying all his teeth, but he said nothing. He was probably pretending, but he looked almost bored, Clara thought, and maybe Nicola Ceausescu thought so too.
"Oh, how you wound me. I mean in my heart, Domno. Is that a terrible thing to say? When a woman surrenders her heart to you? And how is it that you could drop it, let it shatter like a piece of crystal? How is it possible to be so cruel? I tell you there was no damage to my body that did not come as a relief, because of what I suffered in my heart."
"You are such unbelievable dog shit," said Prochenko in English. Jean-Baptiste flinched, and his high shoulders tensed.
"I know you have suffered too," he said. "Anyone can see it. The burden that you carry. I thought there was a way I could help you share it, or else let it drop. But you are proud, Domno. I understand that. I also know what it's like to be too proud."
Prochenko yawned. Jean-Baptiste stared at him, then continued his circuit of the room. He squatted down over Clara and Miranda, reached out his bloody hands.
"Here you are," he said. "I must confess I was a fool to think you were a threat to me. Let me see the bracelet. Oh, it jingles. And so you must see I do not bear you any harm. Oh, I was in time. Why do you think these men are here, if not to shoot you like an animal and bury you in these woods? Why did they come so far, if not for that? But if you live, and you remember this night, remember also this is not for your sake. Your life, your death mean nothing to me." And Jean-Baptiste moved his hand in front of Clara's face. "Not for you, but for you, Madame la Princesse, with my thanks. And my debt to you is paid. You were the first and last to hold my little Felix in her arms when he was bleeding on the stones of the Mycenaean theater. You could not save him, as I have saved your daughter."
Horrified, Clara Brancovenu watched the bloody hand reach out almost to caress her, touch her cheek. Miranda had sunk backward, closed her eyes. Her mother leaned against the wall, shrank away from the bloody fingers, and in the corner of the hearth, her hand fell on a pistol, her husband's old revolver, which Inés de Rougemont had stolen for herself. There was no question of using it to protect herself from this ghost. In any case, she thought, Nicola Ceausescu did not mean her harm. Soon the phantom pulled itself erect again, swung around toward the men who had regrouped at the far wall. The yellow-faced Resistenta man was holding out his own revolver, and now he fired it, once, twice. Jean-Baptiste never paused, but his expression changed, and his gentle, melancholy face turned dark with anger. Blood dripped from his ear. Clara gripped her husband's pistol. She raised her other hand up to her face, and through her splayed fingers watched the old steward pull the poker and the tongs from the hearth-stand, watched him raise them above his head. Students of Nicola Ceausescu might have recognized the precise pose from the first act of Madame Faust, when the heroine gathers the two cavalry sabres from the floor, touches their tips together in an arc above her upturned face. The clean blades come together, a momentary hush before the carnage that precedes the curtain's fall. Now, in the farmhouse library, Jean-Baptiste swung his poker in a circle. The clawed end caught in the nostril of one of Bocu's men, ripped a gash across his cheek, while at the same time the sharp tongs came down.